of blood-iron wire hazed the air with manifestations. She could even feel it buzzing in her noctilate teeth. Snaps of warp discharge, like static electricity, sparked between them each time she opened her mouth to speak. "I have awoken the empiric regulators," said Prosus Gale, captain of the Will of Eternity. "Warp beam is cycling up to full charge." Gale was a former Imperial Navy officer, brought to the light of the eye when his ship had been lost in the warp, its Gellerfield collapsing. He'd sacrificed his crew in order to make a pact with the demons clawing aboard his vessel, swore to give his ship to Abaddon should he be allowed to live. A shameful surrender to fear. Morcath could see that fear clawing at him now, quite. 3. "What does it feel like?" Colonel Baratheus asked. "Different than you thought?" He had to lean close to make himself heard, gripping her shoulder with a claw-like hand in his excitement. "Yes." Helska lowered the binoculars. She squinted with her naked eyes, then blinked away the cold and nestled them back in the rubberine cups. In the black tunnel, she could see a smear of vehicle smoke and the insectile figures of the enemy. She was about to answer the colonel, tell him she hadn't thought one way or another about how it might feel to see the enemy, but her opportunity to tell that lie was cut off by the metallic boom of the 3-barreled Earthshaker battery beneath their feet. Her tunnel vision rocked, and when she steadied it, she saw the dirty puff of an airburst above the clambering enemy. Some stopped moving. "On target!" called the artillery officer to their left, peering like them out the fire control bunker's vision slit. He snarled in concentration and keyed his handvox again. "We've got it zeroed. Survivors moving. I see light armor, salamander scout vehicle. Looks like some chimeras behind. Reel it in 1 point and a 1/4 degree left. Grid square, green 2-0. They'd been firing for 4 hours, ever since Baratheus had got a signal from the spotter team he'd sent up Rosvar's dagger. The dagger was a sheer peak, climbing 2,000 feet above the Delvian Cleave, so steep the artillery observers, all of them mountain lads who'd grown up in the Northern Massif and had scored well during the 24th Alpine Games, had needed to ascend with ropes and crampons. There was a desolate little pillbox up there, clinging like a wasp nest to the side of the cliff face, just below the natural cloud layer. Due to their height, the observers could see 2 miles further than the heavy artillery emplacements on the northern end of the Cleave. But Earthshakers didn't have to see things to kill them. So shortly after Baratheus' speech, they'd started dropping long parabolas of fire down the slopes, past the point where the ridges and natural grade of the mountain interrupted their vision, to ravage the Volscani all morning. That was the irony, really. Cadia was being pounded from orbit, almost without answer, yet down here, in the grey saw-teeth of the Rosvar, it was the opposite. But now they could see the enemy, and Mada Helska would have to live up to the legacy of family and the expectations of training. She touched her uncle's sword, sending up a prayer for strength. Absently, she thought she should check the engraved wooden box in her footlocker, where she kept his plasma pistol. Sitting in the cold was bad for the coils. Not that she'd warm it up. She'd never even touched the thing. The mere thought of it summoned up the ghost smell of burned flesh in her nostrils. "Fire!" said the artillery officer, and the floor rumbled again. "I remember the first time I saw the enemy," said Baratheus, this time switching to their in-helmet command vox band. "On Sagathis. First time I'd been off Cadia. Agri-world given over mostly to grain. Big rolling fields of it from horizon to horizon. An enemy tank column was burning its way through, and I wondered what poor bastards were assigned to stop them. When I realized— "Fire!" said the artillery officer, and the floor rumbled again. "I remember the first time I saw the enemy," said Baratheus, this time switching to their in-helmet command vox band. "On Sagathis. First time I'd been off Cadia. Agri-world given over mostly to grain. Big rolling fields of it from horizon to horizon. An enemy tank column was burning its way through, and I wondered what poor bastards were assigned to stop them. When I realized it was us, me, a 17-year-old cadet lieutenant in my White Shield company, I about shat my uniform." And did you? Helsker asked.
Shit myself.
Stop them.
We did.
He paused and raised his magnoculars.
But I had a realization. I wasn't up to it. Not up to stopping them. Just like you aren't.
The hells I'm not, she hissed. Helsker dropped her magnoculars, stared him down, breath misting. She felt lightheaded, the adrenal hit from the insult rushing into a system starved of oxygen by the altitude. What do you think you're doing telling me that? What? The others get a poem and I get a running down. I should...
Relax, Marder.
Baratheus raised a hand.
I'm telling you this because I respect you. And this is the most important thing you need to understand as an officer.
He glanced back over his shoulder, at the side gun port looking above the floor of the cleave, at the troopers fortifying the foxholes and trenches.
What I mean is no one is up for this. Not you, not me, not Lord Castellan Frecking Creed. War isn't natural. Nothing second nature about standing in a hole, holding it as the las fire screams in. People aren't built for it mentally. It rips us up. So to survive, to do what needs to be done and stop them,
he pointed at the distant column of enemies,
we have to become someone else. High Command does most of the work for us. They put us in uniforms and regulate our haircuts, give us titles based on our role in the machine. Lieutenant, sergeant, gunner, pilot. Tell us how we're part of a great institution full of traditions and bravery. Fill our eyes with films of great deeds. To bury that person we are and make us into the tools we need to be. But the last step, you have to take yourself, Marder. You need to step into that other person who would stand when Marder Helsker would run. Who will trade the lives of men and women she cares about for yards of dirt she's never seen before, and never will again. Who will manipulate people who trust her to take actions that will end in bloody ruin and call it leadership. Colonel, we're about to face the enemy. And you need to find that person. Put it on like an Astartes donning his battle plate. Because without it, you won't get through this.
She stared at him, mind reeling. This was recidivist talk, discussing Cadia as if its culture and traditions were some grand conspiracy to dupe its population into giving up their lives. But it was true, wasn't it? She could feel it. Just do one thing. Don't lose the person you are now. Remember her. Hold her close and keep her secret so you can find her when this is all over. Because if you don't, if you become the armor, well, that's how you get someone like her Saka Frecking Creed. Yes, sir, I understand, sir, but no, you don't. Not yet. He snorted. You know what I saw on Segatis. Sir? Children playing in the streets. I didn't know children did that. Here they would have already been. He cocked his ear. Do you hear? He asked. She did. A high, irregular whistle like a military band member failing to hit a top note on a flute. Incoming! The artillery captain shouted into his handset. A flash like heat lightning blinked in the gun slit, and the front of the bunker slammed inward at Helsker. The world went searchlight white, and she knew nothing but the hot tang of blood on her tongue. Morcath knew that when the War Master was truly angry, he got quiet. Indeed, the more furious he became, the more still he appeared. Now he was like a moon, unmoving and cold. Even his thoughts had almost frozen into a regimented ticking, like the precise movement of a fine chrono. Around him, the mutated outgrowths Morcath had used to tame the bridge were all motion. Overcharged with empiric energy from the weapons firing, they twitched and flexed. A wall of grey-pink lungs inflated and deflated. Fingers emerging from the ceiling waved like anemones. Fine hairs raised on the shivering skin that covered half of the War Master's throne. Abaddon asked no questions, elicited no explanation for why the warp beam had failed. Instead, he said, "We will initiate the contingency. Corda, inform the Legion and commence bombardment. Priority targets are enemy strongpoints around the designated landing zones. And keep fire on Kazakraf. Do not allow them to sally and strike our planetfall sites." "Abaddon, War Master," slurred Ercanthos, the demon part of him unable to contain its eager glee. "You promised me, Cadia. Name me commander and—" "You are ahead of yourself, Ercanthos. We bombard to reduce the enemy's defenses and pin their forces down while we secure landing zones and objectives. Once the enemy's stronghold is cut off, then you may march for Kraf. I wish to land now, and do not forget your pledges, Ercanthos. Whatever half of you remains mortal is still my man. I suggest you use this time to prepare your forces. As we have already discovered, these corpse worshippers have proven more resourceful than we expected, but not more than we planned for." The War Master stepped up to the great double doors of the bridge. Two hulking mutants, chained to the wall, bowed their bone-plated heads and dragged the doors open for him. "Corda, I want to hear a full bombardment in 10 minutes. I expect a progress report on the marshalling within an hour. Morkath!" She ran to his side as he swept out the door into his soundproofed mapping chamber. Inside, incense curled up from a yellowed ritual bowl made from an Eldari skull. A flayed skin map covered one wall, an inked version of the Kraf combat zone on its goose-fleshed surface. Abaddon stared at it. "I am sorry, War Master. There was no malfunction in the fortress. I can feel it. Apologies mean nothing. They have deployed a countermeasure." The War Master swept 2 fingers over the tattooed spires of the Elysian fields, setting the ink swirling. "They've discovered how to harness Cadia's pylon network. It surprises me, given your knowledge of the Noctilith, that you could not detect that. I can explain. Explanations are a waste of my time. Find me a solution, or I will have you down on the surface leading a cultist attack." "You cannot allow Ercanthos to lead the assault on Kraf." He did not deign to respond. Instead, he swept a hand over a marker of troops and herded them towards a pass in the Rosvar Mountains. "War Master, if Ercanthos ascends, your careful balancing of patronage will be upset. I can no longer fully read his thoughts." "I know he cannot achieve demonhood. Why else would I have ordered Corda to fire on him?" Morkath blinked, stunned. "But if Corda reveals, Corda can keep his mouth shut and take a beating when it suits his purposes. No sense hiding it from you. You'll probably see it in his thoughts before long. Watch him, Morkath. Ensure he does not intend to use that information against me." "Yes, War Master. But Ercanthos is already half ascended. If he completes it, there will be an eternal struggle." The War Master stroked the map's shivering skin, conjuring an Iron Warrior's glyph amid the Elysian fields. "Cadia will be a slaughter no matter what we do now." 4. In High Command's underground strategium, Creed leaned over the massive holotable, blowing cigar smoke through the projection. Through the door, they could hear a constant babble of voices as officers shouted at each other, took Vox reports, and tried to fix enemy movements. "General," said Kell. He offered a glass that Creed took without looking. "Operator, have we had a holo update yet? No? Should be soon, eh?" Creed tilted the glass to his lips, then paused, sniffed it. "Colour Sergeant, this is water." "Yes, sir," Kell responded. "Hydration is important." "The only water I want in this glass should be frozen and floating in Amasek," Creed said, holding it out for Kell to take back. "Preferably floating about 2 or 3 inches off the bottom."
Kell made no move. "Oh, very well." Creed rolled his eyes and drank the water. "Oh, very well." Creed rolled his eyes and drank the water down, grimacing. "Kell's as bad as my personal medic. Wants me to have a strong heart and clean liver." The tactical officers laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Too much tension. With a flicker, the holotable blinked, changed. "Oh, there we are," Creed said. "Quadrant officers, updates. Cardinal points starting north and going chronowise." The holo showed the craft battle sector, the Kaza at its center, surrounded by its two concentric rings of curtain walls. Alpha Curtain was the outer wall, which girdled nearly all of Craft Plain and stretched far out east, while Beta Curtain was the inner wall, standing 5 miles off the citadel walls of the fortress city itself. There were so many units on the holo it was nearly impossible to read, so Creed had sliced it like a pie, assigning each cardinal direction to a different tactician for monitoring and updates. "Northern Quadrant," snapped one officer, "has had a report from Wolf Lord Orphan Highfell. The Iron Warriors have landed, dropped citadels outside Kazajark, here and here." He indicated, stretching out 2 fingers in a V at the spires that had blinked into existence on the edge of the plain. "Strange. If it were me, I'd have dropped them closer to Craft, used them to stage siege elements and create a forward base for bombard artillery." "They could be trying to cut us off from Kazajark and the Sword of Defiance," the tactician guessed. "Separate us from our Astartes forces. The Dark Angels are tearing up the enemy landers. Observation teams report the Defiance has destroyed at least 2 large dropships and damaged another." "Well, perhaps they don't know how small those Adeptus Astartes contingents are." Creed ran a hand over his mouth. Kell could hear the scrape of his bristle. "That doesn't make sense otherwise. They can't be trying to control the Elysian fields. The pylons make it useless as a landing ground." "Well, keep a pin in that grenade, see how the situation develops. Not like the Sons of Rus or the Lion will take orders from us anyway. Inquire if they want air support. Next." "Eastern Quadrant has major activity," said the tactician. Her dark eyes and skin reflected the data slate. She was pressing the microbead into her ear with one hand and scrolling through a slate with the other. "Multiple landing sites, large air engagement in the northeast air corridor, Titan contacts by Baroness Vardus and her lancers. Reports are still coming in, and some have already proven erroneous. Strictly speaking, it's a mess, General. Suggest we move on and give it a few minutes for the situation to clarify." "Very well," Creed nodded. "South. Holding, though they're under heavy orbital bombardment. It seems like the enemy—" "Crash report!" interrupted the Northern Quadrant officer. "Dreadclaw landing, north Alpha Curtain wall. Enemy disembarking." The young man looked at Creed, sweat on his brow. "Heretic Astartes, General. They're on the wall." Cervantes Glaive wished he was still underground. He was a tunnel fighter, used to the cramped corridors, not the vaulted ceilings of the Northern Alpha Curtain's heavy gun deck. Underground, you could control fields of fire, and nothing came smashing through the wall. The warning klaxons hadn't even cranked to full scream when the impact shook the gun deck. Glaive went down on his side, the ceramic shell of his carapace armor scraping on the rockcrete with a hollow sound, jamming the bottom edge of the breastplate into his ribs. Muscle memory and training had him on his feet before the regular infantry around him. While they tried to drag themselves up, hands locked in their las rifles, Glaive dropped his volley gun and pushed up with his hands, only retrieving the weapon once he was on his feet. His hand ached as he hefted the volley gun and snapped the servo arm to his rig. Check surroundings. Report threats. He quick-scanned the gun deck, took in the vaulted ceiling 15 stories above his head. The guns, all the size of hab blocks, sat on vanishing carriages that raised the massive artillery up to the gun ports, then dropped them back to the floor after they discharged to shield them from fire. The ammunition hauler vehicles that queued up to the cargo cranes that loaded the train car-sized ordnance into the smoking breeches of the guns. Elsewhere, wobbling sentinels used the clamps of their gripping arms to remove any burned-out block cells powering the laser rays and bring in fresh ones. Someone in authority,
Someone who knew what they were doing for a change had posted Glaive in his deep patrol down here. Knew they were tunnel fighters, and thought they'd be better here than on the wall. But it was hard to understand what was going on here, even when they weren't getting hit. Despite the sonic dampener fields around the guns and a personal dampener clipped to his webbing, Glaive's heads-up display was reading decibel levels so intense they'd cause hearing loss and heart arrhythmias within days. It felt like being pounded in the break zone of a stormy coast. "Up! Up!" Sergeant Vescad shouted through the Vox. He raised his hell gun. Glaive saw it then, above. A ring of rockcrete in the outer wall, glowing white-hot and crumbling as it burned with enough heat to separate atoms. Melter array. Enemy lander boarding them like a ship. Assess the situation, keep scanning. Glaive snapped his head back the other way, making sure they weren't focusing too much on the trouble they could see and missing the trouble they couldn't. That was a danger of full helmets. Tunnel vision. There was another ring behind them, 10 stories up, fusing and spitting, nestled between two guns to shield it from fire. He barely registered it when both rings blew out with a percussive bang, blasting crumbled masonry outward into the cordite hazed air of the gun deck. Hunks of rock tumbled into the gunners and ammunition gangs below. But not all of them fell. A few dropped and rose, defying physics, pairing off in ones and twos that... "Raptors!" yelled Vasquez. Through his dampener, Glaive could hear the shriek of the sergeant's hell gun. "Move to gun 17! Defensive!" "No! Belay! Belay!" Glaive contradicted, running in the other direction. "They're behind us at gun 15! We're closer! Move!" "Do it!" Vescad said. "Follow Glaive! Form on 15!" They ran. In Glaive's heads-up display, a counter labelled "Feet until effective range" counted down as they pounded across the deck. That was the Kazakin way. High situational awareness. Flexibility. Subsuming the ego in service of lethality and survivability. Where the Tempestus scions were doctrinaire and rigid, the Kazakin prided themselves on adaptability and trust. Vescad would have no ego about being contradicted. Fireteam Gamma would think nothing of pivoting to follow the observations of a special weapons operator. Feet until effective range 103. And a good thing, because the horrors were already upon the gunners. There were two, black-armored, diving and screeching. The piercing screams of their helmet vox emitters penetrating Glaive's personal dampener and stabbing into his ears with such painful intensity that the sound broke up in his right ear, turning into a crackle like vox static. Feet until effective range 56. One made a swooping pass on the gunners, mangling two with his chainsword, firing a bolt into the windscreen of an ammunition hauler that spiderwebbed the glass and painted it with the driver's blood. So fast, difficult to see. Nothing but a blur. Only when it briefly reached its apex did it slow enough for him to notice that it had a helm reworked into a dragon's open maw, a barbed tongue emerging from its mouth. But it was the other that grabbed Glaive's attention. It had broken off, slamming feet first into the barrel of the massive artillery piece, its boot clamps rooting it in place. This one had a helmet so incongruously terrible, Glaive would remember it for the rest of his life. It was nothing but an open mouth, like the gaping hinged jaw of a carnivorous plant, ringed with teeth. And it had a melter gun. Feet until effective range 20. Glaive put on a burst of speed. For as its teammate dived and wheeled and killed on the gunner's platform, the moor-headed raptor lowered the cylindrical nose of its weapon and began cooking the rotating hydraulic joint that allowed the cannon to ratchet into firing position. "The guns!" shouted Ocken. "They tried to spike the guns!" Feet until effective range 0. "Fire!" Vescas shouted. "Fire! Fire!" Glaive stopped hard, set his feet, and answered the shrieks of the raptors with the scream of his volley gun. Above, the void field sheltering the martyr's rampart puckered inward with another hit. The field stretched like a Medicay's elastine glove, slowing the orbital missile enough that Maudlead could see it clearly, before it burst through and tumbled end over end, detonating on the outer glacis 300 yards to his left. The warhead scooped a chunk out of the sloped wall. Not enough to bring it down, but enough to create a scree slope of loose rubble that besiegers would find easier to climb than the smooth rampart. The first of the enemy were coming. Groups of cultists trying the walls, organized into forlorn hopes that made piteous attempts to storm the breaches. Masked, tattooed men and women chanting as they came. They cared not, it seemed, that the martyr's rampart remained under orbital bombardment.
"Order squad cruciform there,"
said Marshal Amelrich, still poised on the first step.
"And Brother Legrain with his heavy bolter. They are not to take one step backwards." "It will be done, Marshal,"
said Brother Zalthian, stepping back out of earshot to transmit the orders. Maudleed saw one storming party coming in on his right and lowered his bolt pistol, tracked a running man, then fired. The bolt caught him in the shoulder, cratering his ribcage and killing 2 other men with the shrapnel.
"They are gathering out there,"
said Amelrich, gesturing out past the smoke.
"The masters of these wretched creatures. I can—"
A high explosive artillery round ripped through the void shield and detonated directly overhead, and the Marshal paused the conversation as the shockwave whomped down on them, hot shrapnel ticking off their power armor.
"I can see a banner,"
he continued, raising his voice to be heard over the screams of the Cadian wounded.
"There, you see, crimson with a black device."
Maudleed looked.
"A skull with a twisted tongue, Lord. The so-called Covenant of the True Name. Lorgar's filth." "Word-bearers," the Marshal growled. "That explains the chanting."
A lance beam slashed down to their right, dissolving a section of wall 80 yards wide. Cadians on the outer edges of the impact zone rolled and ran, their uniforms combusting into flame. An ammunition store blew, throwing a Nova cannon as long as a hablock off the wall in a cartwheel. It came to rest across the dry moat outside the rampart, like a log fallen across a stream. Though it still glowed forge-hot, several cultists tried to clamber across. A Black Templar, his armor scoured silver and right arm amputated by the lance strike, leveled his bolt gun off-handed and butchered them. Maudleed looked at the sky, like a man sensing a sprinkle of rain.
"This void shield should be offering more protection, Marshal. I am concerned. The defenses may fail." "We are the defenses, and we will not fail."
Incoming fire streaked in from the marshalling enemy. Scarlet las cannon beams and the flash of scrap artillery mounted on repurposed cargo haulers. "Lord," said a voice. For a bare moment, Maudleed tried to isolate the sound in his helm's vox system, checking volume. But then he looked down and realized it was a human standing below his sight line, the officer he had spoken to.
"I am not a lord," Maudleed replied. "Did we not discuss this?"
"That was Captain Teska, sir," said the officer. "He is dead. I am Captain Voigt." Maudleed narrowed his eyes and saw that indeed this trooper was new. It was a female, with half her head swaddled in a bandage, the spot over one covered eye sopped with blood. She held a vox receiver in one hand, its coiled wire leading to the backpack unit of a signalman.
"Indeed, Captain. Please proceed."
"New orders," she shouted. "We're to pull back to the curtain wall."
"Why?"
"This position is indefensible. The seismic shock of the bombardment has unseated the void shield emitters. It's wavering between 15 and 48% capacity. We're going to be pounded to death before they even encircle us. You're to come with us and assist our fighting withdrawal." A battle cannon round arced above them, and the captain and her signalman flinched, flattening themselves against the parapet.
"We are not part of your command structure," Maudleed answered.
He did not need to consult the Marshal on this.
"Nor subject to any of your general orders."
"This comes direct from Creed. He honorably requests you to redeploy on the Alpha Curtain Wall, southern quadrant. You'll do more good there. His words, sir."
"He wishes us to retreat?"
Amelrich broke in, his eyes still on the battlefield, but no longer pretending not to listen. "They're calling it a redeployment, Marshal."
"Let us leave the twisting tongues to the word-bearers. It is a retreat, and we shall not do it. This is the martyr's rampart, brother, not the redeployment rampart or the tactical withdrawal rampart, not the coward's rampart. It was built to stand, and stand we shall until we can stand no more.
But, said the captain, the Lord Castellan—
Tell the Lord Castellan we have taken our vow, and we shall keep it, said Maudleed. Go if your commander says you must. We shall hold this rampart.
With respect, she said, it's becoming a pile of rubble.
Then we will sanctify this rubble with our blood. We shall defend each brick to the last, and turn it into relics you will venerate in your cathedrals for generations. Go. We shall offer what covering fire we can.
Then Maudleed turned towards the battle, located a target, and put a round through a hulking abhuman that was using all three of its arms to climb up the scree slope. Over the wall, the chants rose. Maudleed could see a dark figure in amongst the rabble, a third taller than the hunched, cowed masses of cultists, contorting as he read from books that chittered and flapped around him like crows about a corpse. The marshal gripped his power sword from its place embedded in the wall and twisted it free of the rockcrete.
Lift the banner, Maudleed. Let us show these heretics who we are. Dawn! Roared Maudleed, and lifted the dragon-tailed banner high.
Below them, the unclean horde quailed at the sight of the long pennant, and Maudleed's heart swelled. The Crux's banner had lain for a day and a night on the lap of the Emperor himself, and though the unclean did not know this, they sensed its power.
For the Emperor and Dawn!
The voice of their demagogue and his surging flood tide of congregants sucked up the little assault parties before the wall the way a large, fast-moving wave draws in the breakers that roll before it. Bolt shells exploded among them, scything through ink-marked flesh and turning bone to shrapnel. A plasma blast scorched down from the wall, its white-blue starfire incinerating 4 cultists, before the dark apostle flicked a finger and blocked the tunnel of light with one of his avian tomes. From his black, dripping mouth, the heretic Astartes said a blasphemous name that could only be pronounced with his serpent tongue, and the Black Templar's plasma gun overloaded, burning the brother where he stood. The wave of flesh spilled into the moat, filling it with their bodies. As they surged up the scree slopes, ink-dark clouds eclipsed the sun, casting the rampart in shadow.
"Burn them!"
called Amalrich, and the burning pilot lights of flamers ignited along the wall, flickering like candles against the encroaching darkness. And as the Cadians withdrew, evacuating through the back gate into the long, crater-marked kill zone separating the rampart from the curtain wall, the Black Templars anointed their enemy with sacred fire. An ancient crimson-smeared drop pod punched into the earth of Cadia like a comet thrown by a vengeful deity. It contained only one man, though whether he was still a man was an open question. Acanthos did not wait for the hatches to unfold. He kicked one open, the percussive crunch of the blow sounding like 2 ground cars colliding, followed by the tortured squeal of tearing servos as he forced the door open with his weight. The descent jets, meant to cushion the pod's landing, had not fully cycled down, so when he waded into the battlefield, he did so through a shin-deep blossom of rocket fire. A wounded seraphim was the only one who witnessed the moment Acanthos, the conqueror of Divorsa, first touched Cadian soil. The favored warlord of Khorne took a deep breath of anime atmosphere, then watched in amusement as the fallen corpse bride tried to raise her bolt pistol.
"You may try, prayer witch. I will give you this."
She made a good effort, but the rotary cannon had taken her right arm and sheared off one of her jump pack engines. Grievously injured from the fall, unable to prop herself up with her missing arm, and kilted oddly on the bulky jump pack, she struggled like an overturned beetle. Sparks flickered in the gorget of her powered armor, underlighting her face and indicating malfunction. Her shoulder blades were almost certainly crushed.
He could hear the bones grinding as she lifted the heavy weapon. She fired, and the mass-reactive round ploughed the dirt 2 feet to his right. With a howl of pain, she pulled the trigger again, but her shoulder had lost strength, and the shot went no further than an infant could throw a ball. She was praying, stuttering a catechism from lips painted scarlet from internal injuries.
"A noble effort," he rumbled.
Acanthos walked to her, and saw on her face the horror his approaching form brought. Her chin began to quiver, either from fear or the chill of blood loss. Corda had called him Half-Prince, a christening that enraged him, for it was true. He was half-ascended, bones too long for his flesh, nerves not gliding correctly, and joints out of place. So much of his new body was like the wings of a moth fresh from a chrysalis, folded and slick, awaiting the warm sun to dry it so that it could stretch. It hurt to move, hurt even worse than the butcher's nails. As he strode towards her, blood sweated from his skin in little ruby beads that streaked down like raindrops.
"You followed your witch leader, your canoness, to destruction. I admire this. And you did great slaughter in the eyes of the blood god before you discovered what was in those lifters, and were slaughtered in turn. Thus, you have twice worshipped him, despite your condemnations."
Indeed, the flying canoness, Genevieve, the demonic whispers told him, and her entourage had wreaked havoc on the initial landing parties until they'd flown into the largest lander and found the behemoth that waited within. The Lord of Skulls had made a fascinating ruin of her body, even though only one of its rotary cannon rounds had struck her. At least 24 more prayer witches had fallen in their flight away. He could see the agony on the wounded sister's features, and for a moment he felt a strange kinship with this false angel brought to ground. They were united in pain. Perhaps that is why he paid her the honor of approaching, why he knelt down and crushed her pistol in his crustacean claw, took her shivering chin between the fingers of his natural arm, swollen too large for a gauntlet.
"Golden god of mankind," she said, "shield my sisters and guard thy shrine. Give me one moment of strength so I might strike."
She started to hitch, her spasming head tugging at his fingers as something vital in her chest started to fail.
"I do not care about your shrine," said Acanthos,
in a voice that spoke half in, half out of the materium.
"I do not care about your sisters or your god, Emperor. I am here for only 2 things: blood and skulls. And you will give me both."
The sun shone behind him, and his shadow pooled on the sister. It began to stretch, its edges unfolding into claws and quills.
"Not just blood,"
whispered the demon Goremouth. And from the horror on the battle sister's face, Acanthos knew she could hear it too.
"The right blood. Sanctified blood. Blood stolen from the corpse god so that we might re-anoint his temple."
It was why, of all the drop zones, Acanthos had chosen this one. He would draw the Eye of Corn with unholy slaughter and be the half-prince no more. The sister's pupils dilated, taking on the glassy, wide shine of brain death Acanthos had seen so many times over the last 10 millennia. A fresh well of blood spilled over her bottom lip and ran down her chin in a ribbon. She was looking through him, eyes wobbling left to right, as if beholding something behind his back. Her single hand, relieved of the weight of the pistol, fought the encumbering, joint-frozen armor and rose, as if reaching out. It was so eerily real that Acanthos himself looked over his shoulder, seeing only the smoking drop pod and field of landers unloading their war engines.
"There is nothing,"
hissed the demon. Death, hallucination. The Crimson God grows impatient. Acanthos realized the sister was trying to speak, and curious, he loosened his grip. Saint, she mewed. Weak at first, then louder, gaining strength, speaking, then calling, then shrieking in ecstasy. Saint! 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 Acanthos tightened his grip and wrenched the head off. It came away from the traumatized vertebrae with a tearing pop. Then, still kneeling, he reached backwards and fixed it on his skull rack, so the other corpse brides could see it when he came for them. He turned towards the shrine of St. Morrican. A temple he would make his own, painted with gore and built on a foundation of skulls. A foundation that would begin with the dead woman who called in vain for her saint. Kestrel was supposed to be picked capturing the enemy landings up north, around the crashed Dark Angel's cruiser Sword of Defiance, cutting northwest along the Rosvar Mountains, getting good shots of the massing attack on the wreck so Craft Command could estimate enemy troop strengths and identify traitor legions. This wasn't happening. She was way off her flight plan, out of the air corridor, amid the crossfire of orbital bombardment and air defense fire, running for her life. "Break! Break!" screamed Darvis. "It's on us again!" Locktone. Kestrel slammed the stick left and then forward, rolling them over into a dive. Heard the shotgun bang of Darvis deploying chaff flares. It was a risky maneuver. The little buzz fighter on their tail was nimble, made for skydancing through a dogfight, but Kestrel bet it couldn't dive like her Avenger. Deadeye plunged, the Locktone shutting off as the missile strayed towards the flares, banging harmlessly to their upper port side. In the top of her canopy, the buzzfighter zipped by ahead of her on its weird, curving flight path, the three fins of its tail assembly spinning like the teeth of an industrial bore tool. So small, she doubted there was a pilot inside. It didn't need one. For the packs of traitor aircraft hunting and killing through the skies were, nearly all of them, warp engines. Machines animated through wicked rituals of binding and sacrifice, things more animal than aircraft. Airframes with pilots melded into them, becoming the heart of a raging, infected nervous system. That was not common knowledge, but pilots were briefed on enemy aircraft variants, their capabilities and silhouettes. Even now, pulling out of the dive, she watched the buzzfighter move like an insect towards a Marauder bomber. It pulled a barrel roll, spinning like a top as it loosed unguided micro-rockets in a volley that missed the lumbering bomber's tail. Then, dodging improbably through its streams of answering turret fire, the fighter jinked in an impossible sideways diagonal to bring it into collision range. It detonated, blasting itself into a cone of flak shrapnel that sighed through the Marauder, sending it on a lazy path down, engines aflame. "Suicide craft!" Kestrel called. "Darvis, don't let those buzzers get close. I'm more worried about getting back in the corridor. A laser ray nearly sliced our tail off a second ago. I don't want to get down by our own ground fire, Hannah." "Copy," she said, pulling a tight turn. As if to punctuate Darvis's point, a flak shell burst a few points starboard off her nose, rattling the left wing with splinters of hot steel. "No damage, too far off." Darvis was right. They needed to get back into the safe airspace. But by turning around, they were going into the thick of the battle, plunging into the air corridor like a sewing needle that had pulled away to tighten a stitch before once again pushing into cloth. And the safe corridor was anything but. Combat raged through the airspace, disorganized, mad. Contrails twisting together like loose yarn left to tangle in a box. Dogfights thundered at multiple altitudes, from the ceiling heights of the Lightning's upper limits to down just above the heads of the disembarking heretics. The Vox was no less disordered. 100 interwing conversations overlapped as pilots fought and died. Kestrel narrowed their Vox link to only the closest aircraft. "Sword Leader, it's on me! It's on me!" "Sword 6, this is Sword Leader. I see you. Keep jinking around and I'll be there in 10 seconds. "Sword Leader, where are you? I'm out to chaff, it's—" A hollow bang on the line. like a 50-year-old ration tin exploding from the internal pressure of rot. A Navy Lightning tumbled past, one wing nothing but an amputated stub of ragged metal. To her extreme right, a Valkyrie of the 119th loosed a hunter-killer that streaked upward on its purplish smoke and burst a Hellblade interceptor, shredding it into a cough of debris. A Thunderbolt crossed her canopy view in a steep angle, running from autocannon fire, only to be slammed out of the air by a Helldrake that intercepted it claws first like a raptor diving on a kill. Shit! She twisted briefly to watch the enemy engine fall with the heavy fighter, talons crumpling its cockpit as the reptilian head savaged one stuttering engine. "Holy throne," said Darvis. "They're trying to bail it. It's eating. Don't think about it. Find me a line to the target." "Affirmative." "Howl Squadron! Howl Squadron!" she said, sending a spike pulse on the Valkyrie band. "This is Spyglass 3. We're breaking northwest to Sword of Defiance and would like some cover." "Confirm, Spyglass 3. Send location and altitude." "Take us lower," said Darvis. "Combat looks less intense down." "Freck!" Kestrel nosed down. "What?" "Debris. Missile, I think." She saw what he meant. They'd been relatively high before, when they'd broken out of the corridor, running from the buzzfighter. Now that they were in lower altitudes, steel was raining from the sky. Aircraft parts, burning wrecks, ordnance, its fuel expended without finding a target, and now dropping like miniature bombs. Something clinked off her right wing like a handful of thrown gravel, and she realized it was spent autocannon casings. Then there were the chutes. A whole quilt of them, thick enough that she found it difficult to thread them, each one with a pilot dangling in the sky. "We're better off outside the damned corridor," she said. "Stuck a handful of debris or a chute into our engine, and we are going down. Can you—" "Still waiting on that fix, Spyglass. Where?" She heard Darvis stiffen just before he screamed, "Evade, Hannah! 5 o'clock! High!" Kestrel slammed the air brake, punching the floor pedals hard to yaw the craft left and slide out of their expected flight line. The Dragon plunged past them, wings folded and claws extended. Kestrel barely had time to let out a breath before the brass wings sliced outward, arresting the Helldrake's descent. It flapped to gain altitude, trying to come up behind them. "Spyglass!" There wasn't much Kestrel could do besides bank and ram the demon engine. She'd committed to the dive. Tried to recover now and she'd bleed so much momentum, the more agile Drake would have them for sure. G-forces stretched at her cheeks. If the Avenger had had a Gatling cannon rather than a Pictor, she might have been able to bank hard and wing the creature with a burst. Instead, all she could do was bank hard left, standing on her wingtip as she zipped back out of the corridor and into the storm of ground fire. Maybe it wouldn't follow them. Maybe. "Spyglass, you've exited the corridor, don't—" Autocannon tracers spewed below them in a line, like the dot dashes on a Vox telegraph. They glowed a sick, poisoned green. Kestrel pulled a hard right bank and punched the throttle forward to max, burning away, angling low to the northwest. "Spyglass 3! Spyglass 3! The Vox blurted. "We can't do you any good out there. You're way off flight plan, and we don't have the fuel to chase you." Behind her, she heard an unfamiliar industrial chatter, and worried the engine had thrown a turbofan. But no, it was just a sound she hadn't heard since training. Darvis was firing the heavy stubber, harassing the Helldrake as it pursued. "Never mind," she said, dipping even lower to 200 feet. Close enough she could see individual infantry along craft's outer defensive works. Red pen lines of lasfire dazzled across the turf. "I've got an idea!" An airburst shell from craft boomed ahead of them, close enough for the shockwave to rattle them in their seats. "Why are we going low?" Darvis let off another burst. "Diving is its preferred attack pattern. It won't dare." She punched her feet on the pedals, yawing the aircraft so it rotated like a wavering compass needle to fly a zigzag evasive pattern. "This low, and it risks missing us and hitting the ground. It also takes us below craft's defensive fire." Another splash of autocannon rounds whickered by. One punched a hole through their left wing, as big around as a bracelet. Steam bled from the hit. Kestrel reached for the Vox controls above her, throwing frequency toggles. Checked the map grid secured to the cockpit wall with rubberine loops. "Spyglass 3 to ground! Spyglass to ground!" she broadcast. "Distress! Distress! Enemy bat in pursuit at grid Beta 79er! Request ground fire!" Kestrel's seat kicked sideways, her flight helmet knocking the canopy's side panel with a hollow crack. She eased off the throttle and saw a stream of tracers drum the air ahead of them. "Armour, no penetration," said Darvis over the chattering stubber. "It's lining up on us."
"Spyglass," a harsh voice cut in. "Deploy flares."
Kestrel stamped her thumbs on the countermeasure button so hard it hurt. Fantails of smoke and firebug sparks leapt up to her left and right, and in an instant the air was full of fire. Major Helska. Major Helska, sir." Helska saw a wandering light. She felt drugged, heavy, like the time she'd broken her shoulder at the academy and the school Medicaid had overprescribed obscurine. She dragged at her eyelids, trying to remember how her facial muscles worked. "Who's in charge?" said another voice. "She is, I think," said the first voice. That was Dakach, their chief Medicaid. What happened? They'd been in the artillery observation tower, seen the enemy, then... Who's in charge? She is, I think. Her brain lit up like a vox that had had a loose wire reconnected, runes flaring and dial needles bouncing. Her eyes flew open, then contracted again as she squinted into the lens of a stab light. "Major?" asked Dakach. "How do you feel?" "Barathas." She sat up. "What happened to Colonel Barathas?" Dakach looked at the other trooper, his orderly Savan, the other voice. "Barathas," she insisted. Her words came out slurred, wet. It sounded like she'd said, "Baratshish." She put her hand to her lips and found blood. Her mouth was slopping with it, along with the rockcrete grit that dusted her fatigues and lodged between her flak vest and uniform blouse. Helska spat into her hand and found it wasn't grit. It was teeth. Her tongue probed her gum line and found nothing but raw, swollen flesh where her right-hand molars used to be. Rockcrete debris and rebar lay all around her, and from the numeral 3 stenciled on the wall, she realized she was still in the artillery citadel, but several floors down from where she'd been. She could see broken pillars and sky above. "There was a hit," said Dakach. "Orbital strike, we think, or a high-altitude guided bomb. Took the top 3 levels off the north side wall bunkers. Knocked out half of our outward-facing heavy artillery. You're lucky to be alive. Damn lucky. The blast threw you into the far corner to the part of the room that didn't collapse. The saints watch over you, Mother Hell. I know I'm alive. Where's Barathas?" Dakach took a deep breath. "Somewhere in the rubble. We tried to dig him out, but it might destabilize the pile and cause more damage. We found 1 foot so far." "And his cap," said Suvan, holding it out as if this were helpful. Barathas's cap. That sergeant's patrol cap he always wore, as if it made the courtly man more of a soldier's soldier. Part of the costume of command, the mask he had to wear to fulfill his duty, because he was not strong enough to do it himself. "Do you have headache, nausea?" asked Dakach. "No, well, yes, here," she reached. "You have a beauty of a lump. Now, do you see why I'm always telling you freck-stubborn officers to wear your helmets?" "I guess," said Helska, taking the colonel's patrol cap. "Yes, good advice." There was something tucked in the patrol cap's headband. At first, she thought it was a prayer card or a letter from home, but when she slid it out, she found it was his poem. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket, and swung her legs off the cot. "How long was I out?" 22 minutes. I think you were knocked cold, but no sign of concuss. You have a Vox?" "The rescue team has one," said Savan. "Good." Helska stood, running a hand through her scalp-tight braids, brushing the grit out of her hair. She turned to the orderly, looked him in the eyes. "Tell the Vox officer to get on it. General signal. I want every section officer in the command room in 15 minutes. Captains and above."
"Which command room?" he asked. "The colonel's?"
"No," Helska said, sliding the patrol cap onto her head. "It's my command room now." Glaive ducked behind the sandbag wall right as it blew inward, the bolt shell punching out a section he could probably stick his fist through. The sandbags deflated and slumped at the hit, causing the wall to slouch and fill in the damaged portion. That was the beauty of sandbags, and why Cadia's southern deserts and beaches had been systematically stripped to bare rock over the course of 7 millennia.
It's coming for us,
barked Sergeant Veskaj.
11 o'clock.
Veskaj fired, the cracked zip of his shot splitting through the humid, smoky gloom. He fired shoulder on to the heretic, a stance Glaive had never used in combat before. Fighting cultists and heretic light infantry, you came at the enemy chest on, taking advantage of the carapace armor's ballistic protection. Face them sideways, and you risked taking a las round in the join in the side of the breastplate. Safer to be shot directly in the chest. But the incoming fire was bolt rounds, explosive, and you wanted to present a slim side profile with your shoulder guard presented, in hopes that if you took a hit, it would glance off like a round hitting sloped tank armor. Glaive threw his left shoulder forward, raised his volley gun over the sandbag emplacement, and let off another stream, causing the diving raptor to break off its attack, run, and circle back into the vaults, chased by darts of laslight. That was Glaive's role right now, suppressing fire. Worry less about hitting the heretic bastards than keeping them unbalanced. Let the others try and get kill shots. He and Fire Team Gamma had the advantage of reach for now. Their hellguns had almost twice the effective range of a bolt pistol, and they weren't about to give that up by advancing, especially when the engineers had so politely built them hardpoints in the event of a wall breach. It was a game of stab and retreat. The Raptors would try to land and sabotage the guns, Gamma Squad would chop enough fire their way to dissuade them, and the heretics would go aloft again. Except Fire Team Gamma had done their job a bit too well. With the gun crew dead, the Raptors had decided to clear the Kazakin threatening them before continuing their mission. The heretics were cagey, cautious, probably because they were thinly dispersed on the wall. 1- and 2-man demolition teams. To his right, Glaive could see another pair perched atop a volcano lance, weathering a storm of las fire that swirled around them like snow in howling wind. If there had been 5 of them, no doubt they would have charged Gamma and butchered them, but this pair weren't willing to risk it with only 2. That was fine with Glaive. Hardened and confident as he was, he still didn't fancy tangling with a heretic assault marine on the ground, much less one that could fly. Where had that bastard gone, anyway? "Deck 2, command! 2, command!" said Luzal. He had the handset of his Vox pressed to his mouth and ear, hellgun ready in the other hand, its barrel supported by the sandbags. 2 jump pack Astartes on gun 15, sabotage in progress. We are holding. Also on gun 16 and 13, A shattering bang echoed through the shadowed vaults above. The halogen floodlights around them, the glow globes on the poles, the running lights of the floor. All of them went dark. "Frack," said Stitcher Kristen. "At least it's only the ones on this position." To their right, gun 16 was still pulled in light. It was not much help. Indeed, it only ensured no one could develop proper night vision. "Everyone, shh," purred Veskaj. "No stab lights, no flares, helmet lenses only. Cover anything that glows. We're changing position. Move left. Slow, slow and quiet." They crouched, backs hunched and weapons low. Glaive could hear his breath in the rebreather, heavy and strong, panting with adrenaline. Could they hear him? God Emperor protect if they could hear him. He drew a slow breath, counting to 4 on the inhale, holding it for 4, breathing out for 4. He kept it up as they slid into the dark, making no sound but the occasional squeak of a scuffing boot. Inhale 4, hold for 4, let it go for 4. His helmet's starlight lenses could see little of the surrounding world. They were light enhancers, and there was not much light here. Paired with the cavernous emptiness of the space, there was little he could make out, apart from the 4 crouched men and endless blackness. Only the glow of... "Luzal," he hissed on the squad microbead. "Your dials." "What?" "Your Vox unit isn't shrouded. Your dials are." Two blazing eyes erupted out of the darkness above them, the blue-flamed irises of jump pack engines igniting only feet above their bent heads, framing a giant that hovered 2 feet off the deck. Luzal screamed as a barbed gauntlet lifted him in the air, blood spouting from a severed artery in his throat. The fallen demigod used the kicking Vox operator as a shield as its other hand discharged its bolt pistol. Wham! Wham! Into Ocken as the point man raised his carbine. Ocken's chestplate cratered and his head exploded into gristle, leaving his lower palate and tongue perversely exposed. Glaive threw himself on his back to stay clear of the monster's reach, sighted his volley gun. "Fire!" yelled Veskaj. Glaive smashed the trigger, holding it down. The move made his hand ache, but that was more than equal payment for the violence he unleashed. The volley gun was at near point-blank range, impossible to miss, even with one shot. Glaive got more than one, more than 10. He burned the power arrays in his volley gun, cooked the barrel, sprayed out so much 60 megafuel lasfire that he could feel the power pack heating his carapace backplate. The beam gutted the Raptor, punching in below where its breastplate ended in a leering mouth, then slicing upward like an industrial cutter through the torso. Heat-resistant ablative armor spalled away in beads, servos fried and caught fire. Even through his rebreather, Glaive could smell an odor like spoiled meat and cogitator parts cooking over an open fire. The right engine of the jump pack cut out. Glaive ripped the beam upward through the head, from face grill to crown. The Raptor slumped over in the air, the remaining jump engine driving it face first into the deck, where it lay still. "Thrawn," Glaive cursed. "Holy Thrawn!" He stood, looking at the fallen beast. "You better put a bayonet in the despoiler himself." He'd killed it. He, Cervantes Glaive, had killed a heretic Astartes. Let them argue he was unfit now. He destroyed a 10,000-year enemy of humanity in close combat. People got their names on walls for that. They made statues of you for that. "Glaive," said Veskaj. "Let's go. There's still another one." "You better put a bayonet in the despoiler himself." "Glaive, shake it off. Let's move out." "Put a bayonet in the despoiler." "Maybe I will," said Glaive. "Maybe I actually will." 5. Deadeye tore the sky over the Aegis defense line, the row of shields and emplacements flashing below Kestral in the space of a breath. Orange tracer fire zipped behind her from below, the work of quad-gun automated turrets pouring explosive shells at the Drake. The Avenger shook, bucked, and Kestral didn't know if she was being hit by the ground fire or the Helldrake behind her. In her peripheral vision, she spotted the bright red glare of an Icarus las cannon. "It's hit!" shouted Darvis. "It's breaking off! Looks like it's climbing high and away." "Thank the freckin' Throne," she breathed. "But we've been chased right out of the combat area, and we're low enough on fuel we're going to have to land with an empty tank and full negative spools." "Well, what's that?" "What?" "On the horizon, that smoke cloud." Kestral checked a map. "It's not tasked to anyone." "We should take a look. That's a weird cloud, and big, like an armored column." Kestral examined the map, scoped the damage on the left delta wing. "Are you sure we have enough fuel? Can you confirm it on the flight calculator?" Kestral waited, hearing the scrape of the card paper wheel. "It'll be tight, but we can make it." They were quiet as they flew towards the cloud. Kestral watched their fuel and listened to the engines, constantly glancing over to check if there was any change to the hole through their left wing. Darvis scanned the clouds for the jagged wings of the Helldrake. She could tell by the sound of the heavy stubber traversing back and forth, sounding like a dead tree limb creaking in a gale. "That's it," she said. "I see it." "Thrawn, it's big." "What is it?" She paused. "I don't know. There are some spires. Run out the pictures. We need to record this." They were already low, already screaming and hot. Too dangerous to climb for altitude now. 10 seconds, Kestral called. "Increasing throttle. Set lenses for high-speed shutter." Affirmative. You see what we're driving at? Kestrel leaned forward in the seat, squinting. The silhouettes are weird. 5 seconds. She felt the forward camera drop, her seat rumbling as it started to cycle. 4. She saw the column now. A cavalcade of monsters, a madman's dream rendered in steel and iron, forges stoked with unholy light. 3. Watch out for those pylons. She made an adjustment, got ready to hit the target line. 2. The Drake! Darvish yelled. He's on us. Freckin' saints. I don't know where it came from. Behind her, she heard the buzz chatter of the heavy stubber. Should I brake? No. Darvish fired another half-belt. Get the Picts! Fire armament! Kestrel hit the override buttons, triggering the cylinder. Below her, the spinning clunk, clunk, clunk of the rotary pictor melded with the kick of autocannon rounds drumming the Avenger. She couldn't look back. Wouldn't be able to, beyond her seat back. Couldn't evade either, not with the pictor ray running. But she could tell Darvish was giving the Drake hell from the way its autocannon bursts kept wavering off-center. Green tracers splashed around them in parabolas, connecting when they slashed down across them, but unable to hold on them in a way. 2 big jolts. They rattled her head forward and made her neck ache. She saw smoke streaming from their right engine, cotton white at first, then oily black. And she could hear the whistle of outside air, a hole in the canopy. Darvish! She wrestled the controls, tried to prevent the stuttering right engine from dropping out. She could see flames licking in the well of the turbofan. Needles dipped, losing altitude. Darvish, are you hit? Darvish didn't answer, but the heavy stubber kept chattering. I didn't hear about it, said Sergeant Menchak. And we're not supposed to let anyone get close without written orders. The Munitorum worker frowned, unsure. I have one of those, I think. Yes, here you are. It's in the work order. He set down his toolbox and took the clipboard from under his arm, leafing through thin forms on cheap pink carbon copy paper. Menchak sighed, letting his las carbine hang across his chest. Here they were, his whole squad on guard duty to control access to the mechanisms of Beta Curtain Wall Gate West. What a waste. As he paged through the Munitorum work order, trying to cross-reference the poor copies and verify the stamps, he could feel the reverberation of the wall under his boots. Rumour had it there was major combat on Alpha Curtain Wall North. Heavy bombardment and enemy movements in view of the south. The east, he knew, was bracing for a massed attack. They'd whiled away the last few hours listening to vox feeds from the aerial battle brewing out there. Hells, the troopers in observation units with their big scopes and rangefinders said even the Delvian Cleave was getting hit. But here on the Beta Curtain Wall West, nothing. Not apart from the orbital strikes that were happening all over. Hells. They were doing preventative maintenance. Why now? Menchak asked. The time for this work should have been a week ago. The Munitorum civilian shuffled his feet, nervous, no doubt, that they might not allow him to finish his assigned task. It's a standard maintenance cycle. You can see it on the form. Today is the date it comes due. Every 6 months we have to inspect the gate's operation and apply lubricants. You couldn't have done it earlier? He shook his head. I'm not responsible for that. They give me the work order and I do it. I have to follow orders. And I have orders to keep people away, Menchak replied. Quite so, yes, quite so. The worker dipped his head in deference. But imagine if the enemy came and it refused to close, due to not having performed proper maintenance rights. How long? 2 hours at most, then I'm gone. Menchak handed back the clipboard. You have 90 minutes, and you need to open the toolbox. Do I look like a heretic recidivist? You have to follow orders, so do I, Menchak said, a note of annoyance in his voice. There's been a new wave of bomb attacks today, one at an airfield fuel depot. They told me I have to ask, so I have to ask. The Munitorum worker shrugged and clicked open the toolbox, holding it out at arm's length. Menchak leaned over the box, looking at the rack of files. They smell bad. They are bad. I'm supposed to wear a gas hood applying it. Highly caustic, eats away rust. You might not want to lean so close. The stoppers are only so effective. Menshak backed off a step. Just hurry. Our commissar makes her rounds in 2 hours. I don't want to have to explain. You won't, said the worker, weaving through the squad. Within 5 minutes, Jan Ravetska had secured a descent line to the wall top above Beta Curtain Wall West. Donning his gas hood and rubberine gauntlets, he clipped the automated ascent-descent reel on his harness to the rope and carefully rappelled to the top hinge, toolbox slung over his shoulder. The gate was large, 12 stories, big enough that when the wind came down off the Rosvar Mountains, it created a gale blast wind tunnel through the open gates. They were open now, to permit the free movement of troops if necessary for a sally or raid, and the air tunnel pulled Ravetska away from the hinge for a moment, despite the fact that he'd sheltered in the V of the open gate. He pinwheeled one arm, reaching out with a maintenance climbing axe to hook the edge of the hinge and pull himself closer. Secured himself in place with a magnet line. Please, he said, do not harm me. I am a servant, and you have greater purpose. With one shaking hand, he reached down and withdrew a file, uncorking it with his gloved thumb and using his other hand to fit it in the rear chamber of an industrial point sprayer with its long, needle-thin tube, like the ones tank crews used to apply oil and unguents to out-of-reach areas. In the tube, the primordial being bubbled. Shh, shh, he whispered. Be easy. It is not time. Patience, patience. The hinge was 10 feet tall, and for a moment he worried the contents of the file was not enough. But as he worked his way down the hinge, it was clear there was more than enough. Where he squeezed the pus-like substance, it sizzled and curdled with delight, dripping down the joints Ravetska tried his best to fill. Then, so slowly that he believed it was his imagination at first, it began to retreat. More gel than liquid in the open air, it crawled and oozed against gravity to slip into the depths of the metalwork and spread itself over the loops and pins of the enormous hinge. When he was done, Ravetska jettisoned the tube and let it fall, the ping of the file ejecting, cutting through the rush of the wind. It spun away, disappearing below. The interior of the curtain walls was practically a refuse dump, and it would not be noticed. He whispered a prayer as he loaded the next file, sweating despite the piercing claws of the wind. Ravetska did not like touching it. In fact, his whole body was screaming that he should take the case of files off his shoulder, hold it at arm's length, and drop it into the heap below. But over his shoulder, he could feel the empty man watching him, supervising his work. Yet the eyes were no longer the empty black of the void. Instead, the irises swirled with the cloudy, oil-slick rainbow of the Empyrean that he'd seen in the sky every night of his life. It made his skin prickle, pressure in his sinuses. He continued his work, the thing that he had been training for ever since the empty man had come to him as he slept, at the age of 10, saying it had a job for him, a small thing that would be greatly rewarded. The packet of powder was exactly where the empty man had said he'd find it, behind a loose brick in the garden. And his uncle's steaming pot of lactee was unattended, just as he had said it would be. That night, the mortuarians had taken his uncle out the front door, lying beneath the silk banner of the Ravetska trading house. And little Jan had a dream so delicious he'd never forgotten it. A dream where he had power. Power over himself, mostly, but that gave him power over others. And for the youngest ignored son of a trading house with no martial tradition, that was no small thing. Jan had always been good at convincing people. Parlor tricks and delusions came easily to him. He could convince his mother and father to do nearly anything he wanted, and he manipulated with easy confidence. Yet this dream showed him a future where he could gain followers and talk women into bed with the slightest effort. But what interested him most was it showed him how to lie. Not merely deceive, but change reality. To give a man a coin, tell him it was a confection, and watch as he tried to eat it. an ability to reshape what others saw simply because this short young man was so trustworthy they believed him over their own eyes. The power of suggestion, weaponized. Just as the sergeant had looked at the blank stack of paper and seen a work order. Ultimate power. Ping! Another capsule ejecting. The sound brought Ravetska back to himself, and he found that he was drooling on his Munitorum uniform. He reached back for the tubes and found the case empty. For an instant he panicked, then realized he was at the bottom of southward hinge. The last hinge. Had he not remembered the task, become so subsumed in the work that he'd finished in a meditative trance? But that would mean he had descended the wall, ascended it again, resecured the line on the opposite side, and done it all again. 5 hinges he could not recall. No matter. It was time to be gone. He ditched his gloves down the side of the wall in case they'd been contaminated, scrambled back up and packed away his line and descent kit. Checked his chrono. 50 minutes. He'd lost 50 minutes. True to his word, he was gone before the commissar made her rounds. Zaraphiston's eyes, rolled backwards in his head, looked like the blank orbs of a blind man. His lips moved like those of a sleeper whispering in dreams. Ordinarily, Zaraphiston screened his thoughts in Morcath's presence, knowing either by instinct or wisdom that she could see the impressionistic splashes of his conscious and unconscious mind. But now he let her see. Allowed her to glimpse the image of 2 staring eyes that floated above his shoulders like insect wings, the uncanny colors of the warp boiling across the irises. Then his natural eyes rolled forward, and the ghost irises vanished. "It is done. I apologize for the interruption, War Master." "If you deliver what you have promised, there is no need for apology." It was an intelligence council, a meeting of Abaddon's inner circle within the inner circle, with only 3 participants besides the War Master himself. Zaraphiston as Lord Deceiver, the Alpha Legion spy master Cicadius Siren to provide operational briefings, and Morcath to monitor proceedings. "We had been discussing the specialist Vox centers." Siron tapped a pale finger, ungauntleted on several points marked around Kazakraf. His incongruously gentle touch caused the shackled map abhuman to shudder. "They would serve as artillery spotters inside the city, calling targets and directing fire. Your units are in position to execute?" Zaraphiston pulled his hood up, hiding his inky eyes. "They are, and the first wave of strikes has already begun. Martyr bombings targeting infrastructure and other soft targets. They will continue to pull forces away from the walls. But as you know, that is prelude." The War Master nodded. "The Raptor attack on the northern curtain wall. How goes that?" "Heavy resistance." Siren ducked his head to one side, lips pulling up in an expression of managed distaste. His thoughts manifested as a tarot layout, played in solitaire, columns reshuffling as new cards were revealed and played. "But it's Cadia. There will always be heavy resistance. If there were not, I'd suspect an ambush. We are achieving our objective there, shielding Crom Gat and his Iron Warriors. But the raiding force are paying for it, and it's possible the guns will come back online. May I once again float reinforcing them? Another Dreadclaw sortie and we could—" "No." Abaddon shook his head. "I have already committed all I am prepared to lose. No more." "What about Gat?" Morcath could see how much the abandonment of his raptors troubled Siren. His mind shuffled columns back and forth, turned another card, hoping it would open up a new line of thought. It didn't, and he dismissed the problem and moved on. "Gat's endeavor is proceeding well. With Kraft's long-range artillery embattled, he's disembarking without issue. The only difficulty are the wolves. The Iron Wolves have dug in at Kazajak. The city itself is ruins, but with enough promethium in the underground reserves to supply their vehicles. That may complicate Gat's mission. He has his fortress citadels. Zaraphiston spoke with vinegar, his eyes once again looking elsewhere in time and space. And his machines. Largely unarmed construction and demolition engines that cannot work well under fire. Mere tanks can't do what we're asking of Gat. He's clear-cutting a forest made of Xenos stone, where the smallest pylons are the size of a hab tower. He is up to the challenge, but hard opposition makes progress slow. The bitch pups of Russ, the War Master snarled. Always in the most inconvenient place. Are we at least keeping the Sons of the Lion bottled in their crashed cruiser? We are, said Siren, then paused. Though? The hounds of Abaddon are taking monumental casualties, and they haven't breached the hull. We always knew the Dark Angels would not die easy. They never do. Skyrack wants to unleash an orbital plague bombardment from the Terminus Est. It might be more efficient than taking it by storm. Siren sucked air through his teeth. Though I had hoped to salvage the ship's cogitators. Acanthos will not like it, said the War Master. We do not want to set our cornates against our Nurgle contingent. He's not with them, said Zaraphiston. He's gorging himself on sororitas blood at the shrine of St. Morican. Strange, said the War Master, and Morcath felt her father's well-hidden disquiet as much as saw it. What else? Southern attack is ahead of schedule. Only this far southern Ravelin is holding out. There are Astartes there. We are keeping them pinned and bypassing. The Volscani are meeting resistance in the Rosvar, but we predict they'll force the pass in the next 12 hours. Legio Vulcanum are moving on the outer curtain wall in the east. Anything else? The fortress is still unable to fire. Morcath cut in, knowing that if she let any more demigods speak, she would never get a word in edgeways. And I am getting strange monitoring readings. Things are shifting. Realigning. Power from the deep fortress seems to be interrupted. The War Master turned towards her. I have heard a report that may interest you. Siren? We had an observation sighting after the battle with the Firemane's Fang. Half a dozen ships, boarding craft, were seen entering fortress orbit and heading coreward. We dispatched interceptor craft that destroyed 2, but that leaves several unaccounted for. You think we have saboteurs? Morcath could hear the horror in her own voice. Why was I not told? I thought it was your job to know about the fortress, Zaraphiston hissed. Or is that beyond your ken, Noctilith child? Morcath's blackstone teeth pressed together. This is not a traditional voidcraft. It is not a built object. It is a living thing we have saddled and pretended is a ship. All our bridges and consoles are a mere overlay so we can tell it where to go and coax power into its warp cannon. There are no sensors to tell of breaches to enough, the War Master snapped. Morcath, we will speak in private. We are adjourned. Morcath waited as the others left, staring at her hands, too furious and embarrassed to see their thoughts. She did not want to see what gloating images Zaraphiston had chosen to show her. When the door closed, Abaddon stood, picked up a silver carafe and poured a goblet full of water. He passed it to her between his thumb and forefinger, as though it were a minuscule glass of liquor. Drink this. Morcath knew an order when she heard it. It could be poison, and she would still drink. He was her War Master, and so much more. You urged me to fire, he said, as she finished the water in one long draught, and I listened. That action damaged the will of eternity, which is irreplaceable. I could not know about the countermeasure. Do not interrupt me." The War Master did not raise his voice. Morcath heard the quiet creak of the silver carafe as his bare hand tightened around it, denting the metal. "You have disappointed me, Dravura. After all the favor I have shown, all the freedom I have given you. Perhaps it is my fault, that my belief in you was misplaced." Her father's thoughts darkened, not with rage, but sadness, regret, a deep anger, but directed internally. "No, Lord." She was on her knees before her brain told her body to do so. "You have done nothing wrong. I have failed you. The fortress resists me. I have done my best. You will find no lack of will or study no sloth, but it is a heavy task. The fortress is ancient and deep. It does not think like a mortal, even a demigod. But I can do it. I will do it." She took the edge of his tabard and pressed it to her forehead, but he did not turn to face her. Tears leaked from her eyes, stinging the red flesh round the noctilith eye that had never properly healed, her body constantly trying to reject it. "I want to believe you, Dravura. And yet you have consistently failed to deliver on your promises. To the Legion. To me. You did not even know there were vermin loose in the fortress. I will try harder. That I do not doubt. But I question whether you are equal to the task. Perhaps I should simply keep you a true cupbearer, a creature who watches and tells me the thoughts of others. You are no demigod, and perhaps I should not expect you to display the loyalty of one." Morcath felt his hand on the back of her head, and her breath caught. Hearing her voice, the sound of snot in her nostrils, made Morcath hate herself more than even his soft condemnation. With revulsion, she realized that she was indeed acting like an arming thrall, not a captain of war. Her love for the War Master had made her pathetic in his eyes. She swallowed, mastered herself, raised her head to look at him. "I am no demigod, War Master. But your demigods were being murdered by this fortress until I came to you. I have channeled warp energy through more of this blackstone than all of your sorcerers combined. I have made you master of this relic. You set out to find me because you failed to control the last fortress, corrupted it with a demon in hopes of binding it, yet instead made it feral. Good for nothing but to trade to the Red Corsairs. All these wonders I have done out of loyalty to you. What would you have me do? How shall I prove myself?" She kept her tone even, aware that he could, perhaps even should, murder her for these words. And she saw the thought pass his conscience, flaring like a match head. Quick images of how she would die, raked through with the talon of Horus, strangled in the grip of one powerful hand, his fist closing around her head and mashing her cranium into the table edge until her brains were dashed out. He knew what he was showing her. And she saw those possible futures snuffed out as the War Master remembered the sight of her as a scrawny child emerging from the darkness. So instead, Abaddon knelt, like he had the first time they met, and stretched out his hand. "Find the vermin, Dravura," he whispered, his thoughts a kaleidoscope of promises. She saw herself standing beside his throne, sitting among the chosen, cleaning the blood off his armor as he returned from battle, his hand laid paternally on her shaven head. "Find the vermin and exterminate them. Then I will hold you in the highest regard." "I will do it," she said, taking his hand. It still dwarfed her own, as though she were a child. "I will bleed the stars if you ask me to." Abaddon withdrew his calloused fist. "Let us start with Cadia." Arch-enemy troopers swarmed over Deadeye's carcass, dancing close to prod and examine the fallen Avenger before the roiling flames drove them back again. It hurt Kestrel, seeing the aircraft like that, knowing what was inside, seeing them gather round it like a bonfire in the early dusk. She watched through her binoculars from a quarter-mile away, jammed in a drain culvert beneath a raised roadway. The pipe was barely wider than a sewer access cover, meant to prevent a nearby stream from overflowing the road during the heavy spring rains. It was so narrow she'd had to shove the precious bundle into it first before concealing herself inside. "Darvis," she whispered. They'd got the Picts. At least, she thought they had. The pass had been a good one, given their lack of time and the fact they were taking fire. She'd come diagonally across the disembarking column of machinery, knowing it was the one pass they'd get. Darvis firing at the Drake the entire time. Stoic. Brave. Focused entirely on stinging the flyer as much as he could with his little needle of a weapon, trying to put that needle in the beast's eye. He'd stung it, she was sure. So had the ground fire of its own troops. She didn't know which exactly brought the Drake down, but she liked to think it was Darvis. Yet it had stung them too, as had the anti-air from below. The ailerons and one elevator froze, preventing them from turning back to Craft. The portside engine caught fire. Needles on her promethium tanks dropped to nil. System pressure started to give out. The flight stick loosed in her hands in a way that spoke of broken cabling. She was lucky the steering answered at all. "Darvis!" she'd yelled. She could hear him, but couldn't make out the words, taking wheezy breaths. The man who was her subconscious hindbrain had gone silent. Kestrel had nursed another 30 seconds out of the starboard engine, then brought it in for a glide, coming at the dark green fields of Cadia with her flaps all feathered out to bleed momentum. The undercarriage had taken a hit and failed to drop the landing gear. Thank the Emperor there was enough pressure left to run in the rotary pictor and at least create a smooth surface for a belly landing. She knew before she hit it would be a bad set-down. She didn't know how bad. The initial impact whiplashed her back and forth in her restraints, bruising her chest against the straps and snapping her head forward, then back. It was like being in a 40-mile-an-hour ground car crash with the same crunch of steel. Kestrel had hit it on a downslope, thank the throne, but that meant they slid. Down the hill, their left wing connected with the burned wreck of a Lehman Russ and sheared off, slewing the whole aircraft so it started to go down sideways. When it hit the bottom of the hill, the canopy rose up and folded over onto the remaining wing, and for a sickening moment Kestrel thought they'd both be crushed, before it slammed back down. She'd known she'd have to work fast. There was a lot to do, and enemies would be on them any minute. Her hands slapped release catches, tore away her restraint harness. "Darvis," she'd said. "Lahon, are you all right?" Below the floor of her cockpit was a survival bag. Las pistol, rations, a locator beacon, and a square of camellia line, all nestled inside a backpack. She scooped it up and pulled the emergency canopy release, grateful the hydraulics had not broken. Kestrel scrambled out on the wing, pressing her hands on the hot metal of the fuselage to keep upright. "Darvis! Darvis, are you—" Darvis gave a strangled answer. He was still alive, though only in the most pedantic sense. Lahon Darvis's head lolled to one side, looking at her with one violet eye. The other was squashed, the brow drooping down over it, deformed by the gory funnel-shaped wound that had drilled down through the fibre layers of his helmet and into his brain. "Thrawn," Kestrel gagged. "Oh, Holy Throne, no!" Darvis still breathed in a light wheeze. The remaining eye blinked sluggishly, motes of broken glass from his helmet's shattered visor caught in his eyelash. One hand lay on the control panel, index finger crooked and twitching. At first, Kestrel thought Darvis was beckoning her closer, but then she realized what he was doing. He was shooting. Darvis, horrendously wounded, steel. Kestrel had hit it on a downslope, thank the throne, but that meant they slid. Down the hill, their left wing connected with the burned wreck of a Lehman Russ and sheared off, slewing the whole aircraft so it started to go down sideways. When it hit the bottom of the hill, the canopy rose up and folded over onto the remaining wing, and for a sickening moment Kestrel thought they'd both be crushed, before it slammed back down. She'd known she'd have to work fast.
There was a lot to do, and enemies would be on them any minute. Her hands slapped release catches, tore away her restraint harness. "Darvis," she'd said. "Lahon, are you all right?" Below the floor of her cockpit was a survival bag. Las pistol, rations, a locator beacon, and a square of camellia line, all nestled inside a backpack. She scooped it up and pulled the emergency canopy release, grateful the hydraulics had not broken. Kestral scrambled out on the wing, pressing her hands on the hot metal of the fuselage to keep upright. "Darvis! Darvis, are you—" Darvis gave a strangled answer. He was still alive, though only in the most pedantic sense. Lahon Darvis's head lolled to one side, looking at her with one violet eye. The other was squashed, the brow drooping down over it, deformed by the gory funnel-shaped wound that had drilled down through the fibre layers of his helmet and into his brain. "Throne," Kestral gagged. "Oh, Holy Throne, no!" Darvis still breathed in a light wheeze. The remaining eye blinked sluggishly, motes of broken glass from his helmet's shattered visor caught in his eyelash. One hand lay on the control panel, index finger crooked and twitching. At first, Kestral thought Darvis was beckoning her closer, but then she realized what he was doing. He was shooting. Darvis, horrendously wounded, had used his last conscious control of his body to keep his finger depressing the heavy stubber's trigger. It would be locked on it still, had the crash not jarred it loose. "I'm sorry, Lahon. Throne, I'm sorry. We're safe. Don't worry. We're safe." She slipped her own flight glove in the twitching hand and held it. The metronome pulse of the trigger finger turned to light pressure as he squeezed back. Darvis let out a long, relaxed breath. Kestral was still holding his hand when she pressed the las pistol barrel below his chin and pulled the trigger. She didn't bother with the second survival pack under Darvis's body. She wouldn't be able to carry redundant supplies along with the most important cargo. The armored housing containing the picked film spools had bent shut. She needed to use the access hatch in the cockpit to pull the two heavy cylinders out and slide them into the special drum-shaped leather housings in the survival pack. Kestral could already hear engines on the horizon when she dropped the incendiary grenade into the open cockpit and ran. She didn't wait to see the firework burst of the grenade, bright starbursts leaping upward, followed by the chalky contrails of phosphorus, bright in the gathering dusk. The stream and oncoming dark had saved her, allowing her to move concealed and leaving no tracks until she reached the culvert. Now, huddled beneath the camellia-line tarp, she watched the enemy inspect and prod the pyre of Lahon Darvis, a man who'd flown nearly 200 missions with her, who'd been so defensive of his honor, so proud of the heavy stubber he died manning. And behind her was the pack, carrying the spools of film he died for. Film that showed huge construction vehicles, mining variants with diamond-tipped saws and drills, each testing their equipment by chewing into a pylon. Another lay nearby, felled like a great tree. The pipe rumbled, its water jumping as a convoy of arch-enemy troops passed above her on the elevated road. Kestral stowed the magnoculars and huddled fully behind the camellia-line tarp, a sector map held in her hands and a red-beamed stab light in her teeth. She was north of Kraf, past the defensive lines, somewhere on the road to Kazajag, on the edge of the pylon grounds of the Elysian Fields. 6. High Command is concerned.
said Logistar General Conscavan Rake. He did it with a shy smile, as if sorry to bother Creed with the news. They worry about the course of the war. We all worry about the course of the war, added Supreme Commissar Zabine, then sneered at the glass of chilled lilac Kell offered her. No. I'll have caffeine if you don't mind, Rake said, but lost interest when Kell pointed him towards a service cart. Kell didn't serve civilians. Air Marshal? Kell asked.
Nothing. Get out of my face,
snapped Raven Shroud. It was his first cabinet meeting of the war, the first of Creed's tenure, as a matter of fact. He'd spent the time in his control center, his neural augmetics connected to a theater map of the air war and his trademark pipe between his teeth.
I lost machines today, Creed. A great many machines that cannot be replaced. Worse, I lost pilots and airfields. We've all had our losses, Raven. It's been a long day. They hit us hard, and I know how fecking hard they hit us.
Raven Shroud slammed his palm on the desk, making Rake jump. He leapt to his feet, tearing the pipe out of his teeth.
You're a good commander, Creed, but you don't know the first fricking thing about running an air war. It was wasteful what you did. Wasteful and reckless. You sent my pilots out there to die like some throne-damned Militarum wave attack.
Creed nodded.
It was a gamble. Smash them flat first thing, destabilize the landings, and sometimes gambles don't pay out. That's fricking war.
Rake leaned back from the thundering argument. Zabine brushed her uniform, letting the two save face by choosing not to witness this breakdown in military bearing. But Kell knew this was how Creed liked things. Shroud wasn't holding back. Nothing careful or hidden. The exchange was loud, angry, profane, but honest.
If it was a bet, it was a bad one. A damn bad one.
Shroud pointed at the map of Craft on the desk, indicating flight paths.
Too many planes in the air at once. Too few held back for defense. Not enough room to maneuver in the fire corridors. And when they engaged and started letting off their ordnance and burning fuel, what do you think happened? They all turned around to refuel and rearm at the same thrown-damn time. We had stack-ups at every airfield across Craft, planes circling in spiral queues at 7 different altitudes, most of them without armament, laid out like game birds for the Drakes. And that was before a saboteur destroyed the fuel terminal at Stetson.
Creed nodded, understanding, palms held up.
All right, Raven. All right. You're right. Thank fuck for the Valkyries and their vertical landings. If they hadn't been able to rearm and protect the columns, every poor bastard flying today would be lying in pieces all over the Craft plane.
You're right, repeated Creed.
I know I'm right.
You've broken your pipe, Creed added. Shroud looked down at his pipe, only then noticing that he'd stabbed it so hard into the map that the stem had snapped.
Frick!
He barked in frustration, then flung the bowl against the wall.
Fricking thing. Oh, well, I have another one anyway.
He slumped down in the leather chair and fished an identical pipe out of his rumpled uniform pocket. Brow dark, he began filling the bowl with shredded colac weed.
You are entirely right, said Creed. I should have consulted you, and will in the future. I made a lot of decisions quickly, perhaps too quickly. But that is a consequence of some in high command insisting this war was already in its closing stages and sending out demobilization orders.
He turned towards the others. Well, that is not fair, chided Rake. It is, said Sabine. It is an oversimplification, but fair. There's enough blame for us all to have a slice.
Well, let's not sit here wallowing, Shroud said, holding out his pipe as Kell came round with a lit match. How bad is it, Creed?
Not as good as I'd like, not as terrible as I'd feared. Creed gestured for the sector map. Kell shook the match out, grabbed a map tube and spread out a tactical grid of the Craft defensive sector.
Things are quiet in the west so far, apart from the Delvian Cleave, which is seeing some action. Heretic landings here, north of Craft, the Iron Warriors. Not sure what that's about yet.
Both Astartes enclaves in the north holding out, and I understand that Highfell and his wolves have sallied to try and dislodge the Iron Warriors. The enemy elements besieging the Shrine of St. Morican are here in the east, and of course the ongoing air engagement.
Call that mess off, Shroud said. We need to keep our air assets for interceptor roads and bombing forward siege works. We've lost air superiority in this battle space. Nothing for that now.
As you say, Creed said. South, here, we've had to abandon the outer works due to bombardment. Except this one. He tapped a finger. Who is that? Asked Rake. The Templars, Sabine said, craning her neck. Not fulfilling much of a tactical role there, are they?
None of them are,
Creed puffed his cigar.
Sure, they're giving the archenemy hell, causing casualties and tying down forces for now, but soon the despoiler will rally everyone to the gates of Craft, and all those outposts will be stranded. Normally, I'd say they could harry the back line, besiege the besiegers, but there's not enough of them. Even if the Kazimierz garrison could stage a breakout and support them, there would still be too few of them, and too many enemies.
Creed shook his head.
We're too spread out.
Any progress on the north wall? Asked Rake.
Still hunting out the raptors, but they don't seem to be reinforcing. I like that. It suggests the archenemy doesn't have limitless numbers, and attrition might be viable. We should batten down for a siege.
Creed's eyes bounced back and forth, a movement Kell knew meant he was reconsidering.
Why does he do it, though? Creed asked. You're being obtuse, Azaka, Shroud said, puffing at his pipe. Why does who do what?
The despoiler. We're a problem for him. We control his access to real space, but given the naval situation, we can't stop him right now. Yet he's focusing on us when he could bypass us and strike for terror. He even tried to destroy us with minimal troop commitment with the Blackstone.
Sabine tutted, as if the answer were obvious. Abaddon hates us. His deep enmity towards Cadia has turned to obsession. Lord Castellan, this is basic Academy-level history.
Maybe. Perhaps that's it. He's just done with us. But I can't shake the sense that he wants something here. That we're not seeing this right.
Creed's cigar end floated over the map of Craft, sliding towards the mass of enemy landings in the north, around the fortress citadels of the Iron Warriors on the edge of the Elysian. We need to discuss the ration allotment, interrupted Rake. We're headed towards critical stage. If you plan for a siege, as seems likely, it will be even more crucial. Creed blinked, his eyes refocusing on the cabinet.
Yes, he said. Wait. Critical? What do you mean, critical? We just reduced the ration.
Well, Rake shrugged, as if Creed's gaze made him rethink his wording. A critical stage is now on the horizon, in the medium term. A number of ration distribution centres within Craft have run out of stock before all the district cards have been filled. They've had to send people home hungry. Embezzlement, guessed Sabine. Shooting a clerk or two usually works. It's gone far beyond simple corruption, Supreme Commissar. Rake took a square of card from his jacket pocket and laid it on the desk. Far beyond. What is that? Asked Sabine. She and Shroud stared, brows wrinkling. A ration card, lords, Kell said patiently. Civilians and discharges use them to gain their food. Oh, yes, said Sabine. Yes, I had an uncle who was released after he lost both his legs. He used to wear it around his neck. But 90%? Isn't that rather high? It is, confirmed Rake. And we found 2,000 like it. A group of Kazakin ran into a counterfeiting operation, stamping the things out. Not long after, the press was destroyed, and an armoured vehicle transporting plates disappeared. This printing corresponds to the subtle differences on those plates. But we cannot simply disallow the cards. That would slow distribution to a crawl. Nor can we change the plates now.
Well, how much does this reduce our ration store? Asked Creed.
Significantly. Rake's fingers danced absently on a data slate. By an extra 30 to 40% over a month,
Possibly. I want it stopped. Rick, handle that. With pleasure, Lord Castellan. Though we'll have to cut the ration, of course. Further 10%? Is it necessary? Creed lowered his gaze. Unless you want to run out of food. Creed sighed. I'll announce it in my next broadcast. No! A horrified exclamation jumped from every mouth in the room, even Kell's. You can't do that, said Sabine. Very unwise.
Inadvisable, added Shroud. When Perelska, throne rest him, cut the rations, he never made an announcement.
My distribution centers will be mobbed. Rake's white glove squeezed his data slate. The rationers killed. Here's what we'll do, said Sabine. Gradually reduce the ration, drop it by 2 or 3% a day, slowly enough that no one notices.
A dastardly suggestion, said Creed.
He'd gone stormy.
The people of Cadia are sacrificing for this war, and they should know why. I'll tell them why. We're in this together, and I'll not starve them in the dark. If they must have less carb loaf and protein, they'll know about it. They will appreciate the honesty. It'll be a damn sight better than what they got before.
Kell waited until he'd ushered the cabinet out and closed the door before speaking. You can't tell them you've cut the ration.
Not you too, Kell. You of all people.
I of all people should know. My family had rationers. You grew up in the regiment. Don't announce it and they'll assume the distributors skimmed it, or there's just less to go around, or that their district warehouse was hit by a shell. Cadians are used to weathering misery, and while they won't like it, they'll get on. But if you get on that Vox and tell them you did it, that Lord Castellan Creed knowingly and proudly took bread out of their mouths, they'll turn against you. And we can't have that during a siege.
It's dishonest. Bad leadership. As commander of the 8th, I always, with respect, you're not a frecking colonel anymore, sir.
You are leading a planet under attack where you are the central symbol of resistance. We cannot have that image tarnished with grubby politics. Don't undermine yourself.
Don't lecture me on... You're in no position.
Creed ripped a cigar out of his mouth and pointed at Kell. His fingers shook as he held the stub between his index and middle finger. Kell stood his ground.
Throne, damn it!
Creed collapsed into the wing-back chair behind the desk.
Bring me the freckin' line, Vox. I'll tell Riek.
No announcement? Kell asked, bringing the rotary Vox, picking up the handset and spinning the wheel to dial the extension.
No announcement.
He puffed his cigar, realized it had gone out, and lobbed it across the room.
Freck!
The dragon-tailed banner of the Cruxus Crusade waved above the Martyr's rampart, its steel-woven silk lifting on the superheated backwash of ignited promethium.
Burn them! Howled Marshal Amelrich. Incinerate them! Scour them from these stones where martyrs walked!
2 brothers stood on either side of their wall section, washing the glacis with chemical fire. Heretic infantry screamed and blackened, flames roiling over their skin and igniting their ragged uniforms and ritual clothes. Others behind them, out of the flamers' range, gagged as the inferno ate up the available oxygen and tumbled into the moat, clutching their throats. Heretics burned with the same orange of Cadia's setting sun, which glinted off the tides of blades and armor, so the whole battle seemed a rolling lake of flame. Maudlead found a word-bearer amongst the press of bodies, wading through the flesh of its followers as it discharged its bolter at the battlements of the rampart, staggering one of the Flamer brothers. Each shot from its massive weapon caused the worshippers around it to recoil, clutching bleeding eardrums. From his vantage above, the crowd seemed to ripple around the word-bearer like a pond disturbed by a rock. Maudlead lined up his bolt pistol and pulled the trigger for a 3-round burst. 1 round painted the heretic Astarte's armor with the viscera of an unlucky follower, while the next 2 smashed into its bolt gun, cracking the casing and magazine so the fat shell spilled out of it. The word-bearer's head snapped around, tracking the attack.
Then, in a blink, it leapt the moat, ritual dagger in hand, scaling the sloped glacis of the rampart by sinking the hooked weapon into the rockcrete. Its unholy shouts pounded Maudleed backwards, as if the words themselves held concussive force. The fallen Astartes reared up over the parapet like a monster from the deep, a rune-inscribed grenade clutched in one hand. Amalrich took the traitor in 2 cuts. The first severed the arm with the grenade, dropping it down the slope where the amputated limb rolled into the moat. The second cut passed through both thighs, so the heretic's torso followed the disembodied limb in its descending tumble. A moment later, the wash of the grenade discharge atomized them both.
"Not one step back, Cruxis," Amalrich intoned. "For the honor of Dawn, and under the ever-watching eyes of the Emperor, not one step back!"
Explosive impacts tore across Amalrich's breastplate, punching through his tabard and throwing the broken wings of his personal device into the air in pieces. The stream of fire cut across Maudleed's vision, and he heard a sound like a tank being holed. There was rockcrete under his palms, but he could not see it. Green threads danced before his vision. A hit. Heavy bolter, probably. He ripped off his helm and found himself staring at his gauntleted hand, lying empty on the rockcrete. The banner. The banner! The pole lay 4 feet from his right hand, the sacred silk of it lying limp against the ground polluted by traitor blood. Howling in rage and shame, he snatched it up and hoisted it high.
"Penance!" he lamented. "My marshal, I demand penance!"
He balled his fist and struck himself across the jaw. It produced a meaty thunk, like a farmer clubbing a grox to death. Amalrich had not fallen. Still, he bellowed his defiance at the crashing waves of attackers. When he turned, the heaving mass of them in their black robes, lit by strobes of muzzle flash, made it seem he had an ocean of rolling lava at his back. When the marshal saw the banner, his face fell. His eyes bored into Maudleed. Maudleed struck himself a second time.
"Brother Devrain,"
called Maudleed's lord and master.
"Yes, Marshal." "Please give Brother Lieutenant Maudleed your chainsword, and relieve him of the dragon-tailed banner. The honor has become too heavy for him." "Yes, Marshal."
Devrain revved the chainsaw's blade to cut the link securing it to his wrist, then offered it hilt first. As if in a dream, Maudleed handed over the relic he had carried for 9 years.
"I am sorry, Maudleed,"
Devrain said under his breath.
"Carry it high, brother,"
Maudleed answered,
"where all can see."
Then he revved the gifted chainsword, gave something between a war shout and a prayer, and dashed towards a knot of bronze-masked cultists who had surmounted the wall. His first blow cleaved one man in 2, shoulder to ribs. His next bashed the pommel deep into a cranial brain pan. With his free gauntlet, he seized a heretic by the throat and hurled him down the outer wall into a climbing party of his fellows. Rage could be a great driver in war. Rage against the enemy. Rage against oneself. And Maudleed had rage to spare, as the shadow of the dragon-tailed banner, cast by the setting sun and the fires of a sanctified battlefield, waved over his armor and his soul. Night came early in the Rosvar Mountains. Tall crags began to block the sun starting at 1400 hours, casting the Delvian cleave into cool shadow. It was often a relief after 4 hours of baking sun, the high altitude making the solar radiation more damaging since, this high up, the thinner atmosphere provided less shielding. Around 1000 hours, the sun would hit them square, pleasantly warm at first after the freezing night. But by noon, the roadbed and rocks of the cleave were hot enough you could feel the glow of it in a bare hand. The medicates had even treated a few light burns from troopers picking up metal equipment laid out carelessly in the heat. Thus, when the burning glare of the sun dipped below the mountain range, there was an hour of blessed relief before the bone-deep cold of the night set in. before wisps of cloud drifted through like mist, leaving men and equipment slick with dew, before the dew turned to frost and the wind rushed through the cleave like the shockwave of an atomic blast. It was, Helska realized, as another detonation lit the horizon like heat lightning, a morbid comparison. The orbital round that had hit them had been only moderately large, not nuclear. A kinetic round that had punched straight through one side of the outer defences and impacted the roadway, blasting a hole in the network of tank traps, but inflicting no casualties. Well, Helska stopped at the edge of a foxhole in the roadbed, looking down the Delvian cleave towards the enemy. It was full dark, and not much to see. We survived the first day. Day's not over yet, Major, said Sergeant Revura. They were all walking in a hunched half-crouch, like their spines were bent from decades of carrying burdens. He pulled out a canteen. Water? She nodded her thanks and accepted, letting the ice-cold liquid temporarily deaden the throb in her gums and jaw. She turned down painkillers, wanting to stay sharp. Best not drink too much, ma'am, he said. I have that detail melt and snore to supplement our store, but it's cold as a Valhallan cocktail out here, she finished, handing it back. When do you think they'll melt enough to fill the supply tanks? Never. Not with our rate of consumption. But we can keep a 70% water ration for now. I'm having to move the operation inside, not enough sun to do it natural. Helska nodded and pulled down the brim of the colonel's patrol cap. She'd taken Revura for her command squad, part of a general shake-up she'd laid out at the officers' meeting. She'd also brought over Corporal Udza because she had a good hand for the dials, but retained Barathas' standard-bearer, Zarin Ravel, who'd served with the colonel for years and had fought with her uncle against the Tyranids. Removing him would have been scandal, so now he stood beside her, the regimental banner stowed in 2 cylindrical carrying cases on his back. To make room, she dropped Sergeant Delith into Revura's role as company sergeant and sent the plasma gunner, Kajka, into a special weapons squad, mostly because she didn't want the volatile weapon near her. In his place, she'd brought the sardonic Corporal Lek with his grenade launcher, which he prized for its versatility. Those replacements might cost her down the road. Delith in particular hadn't liked it, though she thought a few days as a line soldier would remind him what he was missing in the command section. Then there was her other big move. Captain Pesk, she called, not loud. She let the foxhole-to-foxhole whisper network spread the call where it needed to go. 4 foxholes away, a figure rose up from the black shadow of the road and waved a swaddled hand. Here, Major. She waved him over. Pesk climbed out and ran to her in a squat crouch. As he crossed, Helska listened to the eternal rolling boom of artillery on the craft side of the cleave, like a distant storm. To her left, on the northern side, the gun mounts on the remaining defensive bastion opened up with a gut-pounding crash. They fired into darkness at suspected enemy congregating points. The shockwave of their discharge rippled through the ground, sending curls of dust into the air. Yes, Major. Let's go where we can straighten up. Helska stepped a few paces away from her command squad, behind one of the sandbag bunkers they'd built to house the autocannon and heavy bolter teams. She unbent her spine, hands on the small of her back, then stamped her feet to keep the blood moving. Are we ready? You haven't come to tell us the winter uniforms came in, then? For a moment, Helska nearly said she'd pass a word up the chain of command, then remembered she was the top of that chain. I haven't heard anything, no. Took a peek out the back with a big observation scope. Things look hot around Craft. My guess is that sending us coats and gloves is far down on their priority list. Should I tell the troopers that? She thought about it. No, not yet. How are you faring up here with the new assignment? If they hit us, Alpha Company is ready. We've got the foxhole demand, a good kill zone laid out with the heavy weapons, and thank you for taking my suggestion on moving Weapons Company forward. They've ranged out their fire arcs with dummy rounds and screwed in their minimum and maximum angles so they don't drop on us. Good. What about our little surprises? In the holds with us. I had engineers ready in the blockhouses either side,
but the cold looked like it had got into the demolition charges, so I pulled them for now. That's our biggest problem, temperature. Pesk blew on his hands and rubbed them. Helska saw it fashioned mittens out of a pair of extra socks. It's not just cold up here, it's humid and cold. Mist gets into equipment and freezes. Could we get a rotation going? Every few hours, send troopers and their kit into one of the wall bunkers to warm up? I don't see why. What? Pesk held a finger to his lips, a gesture Helska would have found insubordinate if his eyes were anywhere near her. But they were down and to the left, staring at nothing, as if trying to identify. She heard it. Behind the rolling thunder of the battle behind them and the crash scrape of the Cleave's Earthshaker batteries being reloaded. An engine. More than one. On the other side of the bunker, she heard the automated quad cannons set in the lower tiers of the bastions start to spit fire. Las cannon batteries sizzled shots. Behind them, a hollow tunk, 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 like a man beating on an empty ration can, rang out as the mortars of weapons company let loose. Helska looked around the corner of the bunker in time to see the sodium flares pop on their downward arc, burning with chemical brightness as they floated to earth on miniature parachutes. Casting the oncoming monster in weird pools of black and white, like a picked negative. "Freck!" Helska shouted. Before she'd thought about it, she was out from behind the sandbag emplacement, waving her arms at a command squad to get their attention. "Armor! Armor!" she shouted. But a discharge from the Earthshakers split the air and they didn't hear. A dazzling lance of red zipped over her head. Another drilled into the sandbags behind her and started a spot fire, penetrating the first layer of cover and amputating the leg of an autocannon loader. He howled. A multi-laser, she thought, her brain sludgy from sudden adrenaline. That was a fricking multi-laser. "Get down!" she said, grabbing Revura and shoving him towards a foxhole. "All of you, get low and stay low!" "Thrawn," said the sergeant, hand dropping to his last pistol. "Is it on?" They hadn't heard it, the zip of the multi-lasers difficult to distinguish at range from the background noise of bombardment, or perhaps the flares had deployed close enough to mar their night vision. But then the monster spoke and they heard. Ahead of them, a rockcrete pyramid disintegrated. The blast sent an I-beam tank trap dancing across the roadway like a thrown jack until it snarled in another trap and pushed it 10 feet with an ear-twisting screech of metal on rockcrete. Lek dropped into a roll and disappeared into the closest ditch. Ravel slithered after him. Udza clambered and dropped, careful of her bulky Vox. Helska jumped down, regretting it when she felt the jarring impact on her knees. "Periscope," she hissed. "Does anyone have a—" They passed it down the line. It was tight in the hole, body to body. These were 4-man foxholes, and with Helska's command squad packing themselves inside, the crowding was atrocious, especially with everyone crouching to stay below ground level. But she took the scope and played it over the edge of the hole. The flares had burned down to nothing but drifting candles, guttering as they floated to earth. Defense turrets still chattered and shrieked, tracer rounds flying in crossfire patterns, but she couldn't see the behemoth. Then another round of hollow discharges behind her, another line of pops and sizzles as flares illuminated the mouth of the Delvian Cleave, and she saw it. High silhouette, slab armor, a barrel cannon she could climb inside with ease. 2 sponsons broiling the night air as it charged forward, sweeping back and forth so the iron tank traps ahead of it melted like ice left in the sun and rockcrete pyramid obstacles crumbled under its thermal assault. "What is it, sir?" asked Udza. "A fricking demolisher," she breathed back. The big cannon on the demolisher's turret thumped, slamming backward so hard the vehicle rocked on its tracks. Firewash prickled the back of Helska's neck as the massive tank round connected. She turned to see it had dead-eyed the emplacement she and Pesk had sheltered behind. It had blown apart and collapsed, nothing but a mound of sand and duckboard, stained with the blood of the heavy weapons troopers. Autocannon rounds cooked off in a box, like firecrackers in a can. Puck, puck, puck. The heavy weapons behind were firing now, filling the air above with streams of tracers and the air with sound. The industrial hammer of heavy bolters, rhythmic double thud of autocannons,
More hollow clanks of mortar tubes discharging.
"Stop!" she shouted at Udza. "Tell them to stop! They're going to burn all their ammunition before the wave shows up. Anti-armor weapons only."
In the periscope, she saw rounds flattening and sparking off the demolisher.
"Heavy teams! Heavy teams!"
Udza spoke into her over-mouth vox mic, pushing her helmet down with one hand to try and hear herself amid the din.
"Unless you are anti-armor, cease fire! Repeat, anti-infantry teams, cease fire! Don't blow your belts on this one!"
The demolisher ignored the incoming fire, moving contemptuously side-on to the heavy bolter and autocannon nests, rotating its sponsons to melt more tank traps, cannon traversing to line up another shot. Helska could see the hides of flayed men stretched across it. Crimson splashed across them as las cannon turrets, expecting a slower attack and unable to reposition fast enough, stitched the roadway behind it.
"Down! Down!"
Helska yelled. Some idiot had clawed up out of the foxholes and was going towards the damn thing. Pesk, she realized. It was Pesk. She could see his swaddled head and hands. Tried to scream out for him to get back in the ground before the tank put him under the dirt permanently. Saw him crouch and yank something on a bundle. The demolisher didn't notice. It was still carving a path through the tank obstacles. Pesk was behind it, on an angle, but the vehicle was making crazy arcs and reverses, driving in circles to avoid being hit. He was out of its fire arc for its weapons now, except the cupola hatch popped open, its armor-glass viewports winking in the sodium light. A tri-dome helmet and gas hood appeared. Red-stained hands gripped the fire handles on the pintle-mounted heavy stubber and swung it around at the engineer. Helska dropped the periscope and grabbed Udza's lasgun from where she'd propped it against the dirt wall, squeezed off a distressingly inaccurate spray of fire. 2 or 3 others had the same idea. The tank commander ducked involuntarily in his hatch, the stubber angling upward as his weight dragged its trigger end down so the burst of fire went into the sky. Pesk rammed the bundle into the rear of the demolisher and ran, leaving it stuck there by the magnet plate he'd activated, red light winking. He sprinted for the foxhole, head low as the red light blinked faster and faster until it was a steady burn. Pesk didn't make it to the holes. He threw himself down in a fetal ball. The demolition charge was faulty from cold. It half detonated, but that was enough. The directed blast stove in the back panel of the demolisher's armor plating, smashed the engine, sent red-hot shrapnel chunks the size of wine corks ricocheting through the interior. Fuel tanks went up, flames blowing the armor glass outward and leaping from every hatch and viewport. Fire licked out of the demolisher's cannon's barrel like a burning tongue. 2 troopers clawed out and dragged Pesk bodily into the foxhole before the ammo blew. When it did, it sent a rolling fireball 30 feet into the air, the gas pods of the multi-melters touching off half a second before the shells. At the roar of the explosion, Helska suddenly realized she'd never put on a helmet. She slammed it down over the patrol cap, buckling it under her chin with shaking fingers as she looked back into the periscope. In the wash of orange fire, Helska could see the shapes of low hulls coming at speed. The demolisher wasn't supposed to punch through. It was to clear the way for an armored fist attack. Helska didn't bother relaying the order to Udza. She just grabbed the handset on the side of the Vox, slammed the transmission rocker and yelled, "Chimera assault! Chimera assault! Make ready and prepare to repel!" She let the rocker go, then pressed it again and added, "Cadia stands!" 7. Rising through the spiral stair and onto the viewing deck of the central spire, one thought occurred to Genevieve before all others. Throne, it's beautiful. From the wraparound balcony of the bell tower, the whole of the shrine lay splayed below them, like a vision of terror. Every window glowed, every arch and courtyard radiating a golden light. The shrine was like a luminous ship floating in a dark sea. Glass-egg windows sparkled, their mosaics of multicolored panes bright like the pages of illuminated manuscripts. In one courtyard, a line of ghost lights twisted and writhed in the dark, the faraway drone of a chant rising up from it. The monks in the worshipful quarter were walking its great labyrinth in meditation, each carrying a candle as they prayed for the emperor's salvation. Yet along the defensive walls were other lights, brief flickers and stabs of bolter fire, arrowhead muzzle flares cast by the wall cannons, fountains of shooting sparks and burning trails fizzing in an interior cloister, as an exorcist tank chorus raised a great Te Deum, their organs launching a missile fusillade into the surrounding dark. Where the sacred missiles fell, they swept the ground in a pounding wash of cleansing fire, illuminating the swarm of sable-armored forms that lurked in the night. Hounds of Abaddon, barbarians at the gate. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" said Eleanor. She stood at the balcony rail, looking down on the combat. Butter-yellow light gleamed off her polished black armor. At her right hand stood Archdeacon Mendazes, his ancient back bent under the weight of his towering mitre. "Less magnificent when you're down on the walls," Genevieve answered. "They are already pressing us, and it's only the first day. Our sisters need support." The Archdeacon thumped the marble with his crook.
"Perhaps if you had not squandered your seraphim attacking their landing zones, we would not be so hard-pressed. Humility, that is what you always lacked."
"I have lost fully half of my host today, Your Grace. I am well humbled. I could not have known there would be traitor engines in such number. And if you continue to speak to me like I'm still a girl in a schola, my apologies." Eleanor cut her off, then touched the combead on her right ear. "Northern Defense, Canton. A storming party of heretics is on the wall top. Dominion Reserve, advance and purify."
"Impertinent,"
Mendazes muttered. "The Archdeacon is correct, Genevieve. Had you not spent them, your seraphim could be a mobile reserve, reinforcing faltering lines and countering enemy breakthroughs. Had you listened when I forbade—
"I am your sister, not your subordinate. You cannot forbid me from anything."
"Yes," said Eleanor. "It's quite a problem."
"She is your sister in vow," Mendazes chided. "Blood means nothing. A lesson I should not have to repeat at your age."
"I need no reminder of what I mean to my sister." Genevieve looked out into the fiery dark, her jaw tight. Would Eleanor, with all her cool intelligence, understand what she had meant? She must. Subtlety had never been Genevieve's strong suit. Since their childhood, Mendazes had set them against each other, with Eleanor ever the victor. Greater with blades, greater in faith, and a natural leader. Perfect in all things. A natural choice for canoness. Genevieve might have stayed a seraphim, had it not been for the prophecy of Cardinal Subara, long dead now, who insisted that Catherine had come to him in a vision and said the twin girls in the Schola of St. Maurican must be raised and installed as canonesses. Mendazes had been deeply unhappy with that. He and Subara never got along. And so Eleanor received the prestigious position as defender and administrator of the shrine, and Genevieve marshal custody of the ecclesiarchy lands around it. "In any case," said Eleanor, breaking the silence, "let us not bicker as our sisters martyred themselves. I requested you for a reason." "Which is?" Eleanor wrote an order on a strip of parchment, handed it to a messenger with a jump pack. "For Sister Superior Anastasia, new targeting coordinates for her exorcists." When the seraphim leapt over the balcony, her pack flaring to boost her towards the west, Genevieve felt a stab of envy. She wished more than anything to fly away. "The archenemy is pressing us hard," Eleanor said. "As you say, casualties are mounting, and it is only the first day. Soon we will not have the strength to fully defend the walls. What is your plan?" Eleanor looked at her, and the light played on her unblemished skin. The soft, smooth face of a woman who led her sisters from the rear. "Do you have your key?" Genevieve's spine went icy.
One hand rose to her chest where the lump of iron hung. "No."
"You do not have it, or you will not do it," sneered Mendazes.
You cannot be serious. Not those monsters. We cannot afford to spend our strength fighting these heretic Astartes. Not if we have 3 super-heavy demon engines joining the siege. This half-prince they howl about is reducing us in order for his effigies to finish the job. We must hit them, reduce their numbers without reducing ours. That means the hermitage of the pit.
"A practical and fitting solution, Eleanor," Mendazes said. "The mind of a true canoness is a wonder to behold."
Eleanor took something from her belt and held it out. It was a key, data-coded and bearing the skull-marked eye of the Adeptus Ministorum. "If it comes to it, unleash them, sister. Show these dwellers of the eye what a hell we can make for them. Tell me we are not that desperate."
"You dare reject this duty?"
Mendazes crowed. "I have never rejected a duty. But why not you, Eleanor? After all, you have that." Genevieve nodded at the machine standing behind her sister, looming like a shadow. A relic paragon warsuit, inlaid with gold. It knelt on one armored knee as if in prayer. Empty pilot's chamber dipped low, and its great cruciform blade set tip down on the flagstones. The left arm mounted a heavy flamer, protected by a tilting shield as large as a man. Purity seals puckered the surface, thick as a bowl of roses.
"Don't be absurd," said Mendazes. "She must command the defense, and it is a relic meant to guard the shrine. It cannot be risked unless it is absolutely necessary."
"You and your seraphim are faster moving," Eleanor explained, raising the key and prompting. "The archdeacon is going into vigil. He will pray it is not needed." Perhaps she would die on the walls, Genevieve thought, and she would not have to venture to the hermitage of the pit. As Genevieve accepted the key, its gene mark recognized her. The skull's eye sockets flared red. 8. Helskill looked at the glowing face of her chrono, its ticking hands and numbers green with the light of radium paint. It was comforting, that color. It reminded her of being behind a lasgun sight.
3 torpedoes were shot down, 2 of them missed their targets, but consist of more than 30 ships. But Admiral Raziak wasn't born yesterday. He had spent his entire career in the Navy, and he knew that if the entirety of Battlefleet Scarus was put on high alert, something serious must be going on. He immediately sent out his 3 sword-class frigates to scout the outskirts of the Vraxian system, with strict orders to avoid engaging the enemy and to return upon contact with the main enemy force. The lack of crew was a large problem, as it would mean not all cannons would be operational during combat, and he would need all the firepower he could get. To solve this problem, he sent transport ships to the surface of Vrax to recruit manpower from the Manufactorum's labor corps. This would obviously hinder the 88th Siege Army logistics, but that would be a small price to pay if Raziak could keep the forces of Chaos from landing on Vrax. Right now, the Imperial Navy's need took precedence over the Departamento Munitorum's, and so these laborers were enrolled as low-skilled personnel on the ship, helping to alleviate the worst of the manpower shortages on board. Alongside the search for extra personnel, Raziak checked all the available freighters in orbit around Vrax and inspected their combat capabilities. Although these ships were not designed for battle, it was not unlikely for a freighter to have at least some weapons on board for its own protection. Admiral Raziak was in luck. A massive bulk freighter called Isra Mors had finished unloading its cargo and could be requisitioned into service immediately. It carried enough guns to fend off pirates and potentially even raiders. 2 other freighters, although smaller in size, were considered sufficiently armed enough as well. He sent over some of his experienced command personnel to get these ships battle-ready to serve in his defense fleet, should their assistance be required. He also ordered 3 other freighters to be stripped of weapons and personnel to supplement the other ships. He would have other plans for these now mostly empty vessels. He loaded them with anything explosive or flammable, turning each of them into huge bombs. Their cargo holds were packed, ready to explode, and their plasma reactor cores prepared to overdrive. These last 3 ships combined would serve as a squadron of fire ships that could ram the enemy and take them down in a huge explosion. Such a risky maneuver was not likely to succeed, but should it prove successful, a single fire ship could take down a vessel many times larger and more powerful than itself. The few remaining crew members required to steer the ship into the enemy were ordered to evacuate at the last moment, but everyone understood their chances of survival would be extremely slim. Finally, he ordered the 3 remaining defense monitors in the system to join the battle line. These battle stations had quite formidable firepower, but were extremely slow-moving. They would slow the Admiral's fleet down to a crawl, but their guns and strong defenses were desperately required. All in all, he had assembled a ragtag group of 13 ships under his command. His preparations had barely finished before he received a signal from one of the scouting sword-class frigates. 3 Chaos ships had entered the Vraxian system, and their energy signals had confirmed them to be Infidel-class battleships. Raziak knew that this was just a probe for the larger enemy fleet, just some Chaos scouts testing his defenses and gathering information. The Infidels did little more than skirt the battle line and did not risk coming into the range of the Lord Bellerophon's guns. But now they had observed Admiral Raziak's strength, or rather the lack of it, and finally left the system without firing a single shot. Before long, 14 Chaos ships bypassed the outer asteroid field and entered the Vrax system with full speed. As ordered, the sword-class frigates returned to the battle line, barely managing to outpace the incoming attackers. These fast, traitorous vessels had split off from the main Chaos Armada in order to arrive at Vrax sooner. Whether the rest would follow later, remain outside the system, or hide in the asteroid belt, the Imperial Navy simply did not know. But although this wasn't the entire Chaos fleet, it would still outnumber and outgun Raziak's fleet considerably. Raziak broadcasted a final message of encouragement to the ships under his command. You are expected at all times to conduct yourself in a manner appropriate to the great duties and traditions of the Emperor's most glorious and honorable navy. Our orders demand nothing else. Look only to your duties, gentlemen. And with those words, their engines fired up all thrusters and his battle line came into motion. They would approach their enemy in a single line in an attempt to split up the enemy's formation. This would allow Raziak and his fleet to use all their available guns and inflict as much damage as possible on the approaching enemy. It would also spare his freighters and fire ships in the rear the brunt of the attack, and keep them operational for as long as possible. However, this formation would expose his ships to a lot of enemy guns from both sides. The Lord Bellerophon had the best void shields, and going up front he could hopefully soak up most of the punishment. The Lord Bellerophon sent out a flurry of 6 torpedoes in front of his fleet to force open the enemy formation. The Chaos Fleet did in fact start evasive maneuvers and split up into 2 groups, trying to surround the Loyalist fleet from both sides. 3 torpedoes were shot down, 2 of them missed their targets, but 1 had a successful lock onto an enemy destroyer and detonated against its hull in a devastating explosion. The ship was fatally wounded and dropped out of the battle line. First blood went to the Imperium. Although the Admiral was well aware of the pounding he was soon about to receive in return, at least his strategy did seem to go to plan. But then a report came in that the leading heretic flagship was in fact the Anarchy's Heart, a despoiler-class battleship, the very same one that had brought Lord Arcos and his warband to Vrak several years ago. Up until this point, Admiral Raziak had considered his chances of survival slim, but with this new information, he might as well consider himself a dead man walking. The ancient despoiler-class battleship outgunned the Lord Bellerophon considerably. It had enough firepower to challenge the entirety of Raziak's ragtag fleet by itself. They were going to be torn apart. But nonetheless, the Admiral would pursue his strategy and continued its course straight through the middle of the trader's formation. The 2 fleets slid past each other in a murderous gun battle. It was a vicious duel and both sides were taking heavy damage. The Anarchy's Heart and its fleet had raked the entirety of Raziak's battle line with broad volleys and lance salvos. The Lord Bellerophon's void shields had protected it against the first blows, but before long it gave out and several of its decks were destroyed. Its communication tower had been blown right off, leaving the Admiral unable to communicate with the rest of his fleet. But their orders had been clear. Follow the Lord Bellerophon through the enemy's gauntlet and inflict as much damage on the enemy as possible. Soon, one of the sword-class frigates was crippled and floated helplessly adrift. 2 of the defense monitors, having soaked up a lot of the punishment, were completely destroyed and dead in the void. The 2 smaller freighters had miraculously remained relatively unscathed, but the Aizramore's plasma reactors had been hit, disabling the large freighter's thrusters and leaving her unable to move forward. But despite the damage, the captain of the Aizramores ordered all remaining power to the gun batteries and continued firing on the enemy. But to Raziak's surprise, 2 of the enemy's ships at the rear guard had staved off engagement and turned about. With his communications destroyed, the Admiral had no idea that reinforcements had arrived. Battlefleet Scarus had directed the small cruiser group of 5 ships under command of Admiral Mazur and his flagship, the Consul of Thraciae. Unbeknownst to either side, it had arrived shortly after the traitor's fleet crossed the asteroid field. Together they could swing the battle in the Imperium's favor. The first to detect them had been the rearmost Chaos cruisers, and they had taken immediate action to intercept. Mazur's task was to cut off the enemy's approach and prevent a planetary landing. Mazur and Raziak had been long-standing rivals within the Imperial Navy, and Mazur didn't feel much for coming to the other admiral's rescue. Instead, he steered his flagship straight for the Anarchy's Heart while his escorts took care of the incoming Chaos ships. But if he planned to stop the enemy from disembarking, he unfortunately arrived too late. The Anarchy's Heart and several other traitor ships were already preparing themselves to enter Vrax's lower orbit to deliver their reinforcements onto the planet. The 3 fire ships saw their opportunity to strike. They moved full speed into the Chaos vessels entering Vrax's orbit. It was a brave gamble, but coming under heavy fire, 2 of them never made it to their targets and exploded harmlessly into space. The third, however, rammed a large Chaos transport called the Acheron's Bane and dealt a crippling blow. Already caught in Vrax's gravity, the ship had no possibility of escape, and was being pulled further into orbit. It burned through the atmosphere, about to crash land onto the planet. But by some miracle during its descent, it managed to steer itself somewhat upright, and although it impacted with the planet's surface, some of its heretical crew and cargo would survive the crash. Meanwhile, the Anarchy's heart already sent hundreds of Dreadclaw drop pods and landing craft down to Vrax, carrying many warbands of Chaos Space Marines to the war below. Mazur realized he was too late. But he still raced onwards in the hope of destroying the mighty Chaos battleship. Behind him, his battle group traded blows with the Chaos fleet, taking heavy damage in the process. 2 of his escorts had already been destroyed. Receiving no response from his requests to Admiral Raziak, but instead seeing the remaining ships of his ally leave the system, Mazur ordered his own battle group to disengage and retreat. It appeared to him that Raziak had abandoned him, so he made sure his own retreating battle group would bring a report to the Navy's Council on Cypramundi about his allies' betrayal. In reality, however, Admiral Raziak had little choice. His own ships had taken crippling damage, and the Lord Bellerophon completely lost its ability to communicate. Even if he wanted to, he could not have ordered a rendezvous to re-engage the Chaos Fleet. Now Admiral Mazur single-handedly attempted to assault and ram the enemy battleship, but he wouldn't come far. Being about the only Imperial vessel still in the fight, the Chaos vessels focused their fire on it and tore it asunder. The battle had turned the immediate space around Vrax into a graveyard of burnt-out hulks. All Imperial ships had been either damaged or destroyed outright, and the abandoned Isra Mors was in the process of being captured and added to the Chaos fleet. The Chaos forces had lost the crash-landed transport Acheron's Bane and 4 raiding ships, but had seized complete control of the Vraxian system, and were now free to unload their unholy troops and cargo onto the planet. The formidable Chaos Armada had been drawn to Lord Arcos' psychic beacon on Vrax, and with great haste they had successfully evaded an Imperial Navy interception. Now warbands of Cornate Berserkers, the Alpha Legion, and Iron Warriors were amongst the first to make planetfall and assault the Death Corps forces, and many more drop pods and transports would soon follow, continuing to rain down onto the surface below. The 88th Siege Army, through no fault of their own, was in grave danger. The hard-earned victories that had brought them so close to the Vraxian citadel were about to be overturned. Upon the ravaged surface of Vrax, the 88th Imperial Siege Army finally found themselves replenished enough to continue their assault against the inner Vraxian defensive line. Their artillery had already begun the task of softening up the enemy defenses with their bombardments. During Lord Commander Jolka's big push against the second defensive line, they had endured crippling losses and exhausted the majority of their equipment. Although they had eventually managed to achieve a successful breakthrough, the astronomical cost of the offensive left many wondering if it had been worthwhile. Over time, they had managed to regain much of their original forces, but the new influx of troops were predominantly fresh recruits. The millions of veteran Death Corps soldiers, whose corpses were now strewn across the Van Meersland wastes, would be difficult to replace. At the start of the siege more than 10 years ago, they had predicted it to be bloody, but at least expected it to be a manageable affair. The nature of the siege seemed perfectly suited for a traditional commander like Jolka. The steadfast Death Corps of Krieg had been selected as the ideal military force to methodically crush the enemy's vast amount of static defenses into dust. But over the last couple of years, this illusion had been completely shattered. So far, the battle for Vrax had been far from predictable. Defying all expectations, the ragtag army of defenders had valiantly faced the Imperial onslaught on every front, and even managed several large-scale counterattacks. And even by the Death Corps standards, they had caused the 88th Siege Army to suffer a horrifically high death toll. Several Space Marines chapters had made an appearance on Vrax as well, causing nothing but trouble and further complications. And due to the immense drain of manpower, the Departamento Munitorum was considering sending less and less reinforcements into the meat grinder that Vrax had turned into. Lord Commander Julka had tried everything he could to continue the siege and save his career. He had exercised all of the standard siege doctrines he had studied during his time in the military academy. He had even leveraged his influential relationships to receive more reinforcements and weapons. Although this had helped him to eventually achieve a breakthrough of the second defensive line, ultimately it had not been enough to completely crush the Vraxian resistance. And so, despite their best efforts, they were several years behind their original schedule. While the reinforcements were slowly trickling in, the 88th Siege Army did not sit idly by. They had spent the time digging deep trench networks and constructing bunker complexes in front of the Vraxian lines in order to prepare for the next phase of the siege. As comfortable as these new trenches were, sooner or later the troops would have to climb their ladders and move out into no man's land again. Seeing as High Command could no longer afford their usual tactic of frontal human wave attacks, they had spent a significant amount of effort on mapping the enemy fortifications, hoping to gain a tactical advantage. But whenever new reconnaissance reports of the terrain came in, the situation looked even worse than before. On paper, the inner defensive line had appeared similar to the other two, but in reality, over the duration of the siege, the defenders had turned the area into a thick defensive kill zone of up to 20 kilometers deep. In some places, it even covered the entire distance all the way up to the citadel itself. This much stronger and better equipped final defensive zone would prove vastly more difficult to break than anything they had faced before. Even by a conservative estimation, it would take at least another decade and the lives of several million more guardsmen to achieve a real breakthrough. Even Lord Commander Julka, who had his headquarters comfortably stationed far away on Thracian Primaris, had to admit that the situation on Vrax, as well as the future of his military career, looked very grim indeed. Little did he nor the troops in the trenches realize that all of it was about to go from bad to worse. The high sulfuric density in Vrax's atmosphere regularly resulted in heavy thunderstorms. The weather forecasts for the planned assault on Sector 55-47 against a bunker complex on Mortuary Ridge did not look promising. But despite the predictions for heavy rain, Captain Fyodor and his men of the 468th Regiment were ordered to start their offensive regardless. Due to the unfortunate terrain, their current front line was quite vulnerable. But if they attacked now with the help of the artillery, they might just be able to move the front lines forward and improve their position before the cloud break happened. And if they could manage to at least capture Fort C-585, they would have a well-defensible stronghold to stand their ground against the inevitable counterattacks. The sticky mud that would result from the rainstorm would hopefully make it difficult for the Vraxians to organize an effective assault to recapture the fort. The relatively newly arrived 46th Line Corps had of course also been part of Julka's monumental big push, but their fresh regiments still had something to prove. As modest as the anticipated gains for the assault against Mortuary Ridge would be, it would at least be something. They were eager to prove their combat prowess. Rain or no rain, they would push on. And so as the artillery opened up their barrage, 5 companies under Captain Fyodor's leadership, accompanied by several Macarius heavy tanks and Lehman Russes, moved out of their trenches. Over a 4-kilometer wide front, they made their way up the steep slopes of the ridge. Although the troops managed to get quite close to the enemy bunkers all along the line, the attacks started to bog down under heavy fire. Many of their tanks had in fact already been immobilized by anti-tank mines. Unable to move forward, they simply continued to fire their turrets into the bunkers, until well-aimed Vraxian artillery strikes would bring an end to them. But one of the Macarius heavy tanks managed to get through unscathed and now spearheaded the attack on Fort C-585. Supported by infantry, it finally got to the top of the ridge, where its heavy weapons caused havoc amongst the defenders. With well-aimed grenades and lasgun fire, the troops started to methodically clear out the defenders. The Vraxians realized their position was about to be overrun, so they called up their reserve infantry from the rear of their line. A large wave of Vraxian militia infantry rushed over the terrain up to the front line. As the counterattack charged into the battle, it turned into a bloody melee. Shovels, axes, sabers, and bayonets hacked and sliced at each other in a brutal hand-to-hand combat. But through their discipline and unwavering resolve, the Death Corps weathered the frenzied mob of militia forces and even managed to regain the upper hand in the fighting. They had come close to their objective of capturing Fort C-585. Now was the time for Captain Fodor to call in his own reserve companies and decisively win the battle. Back from their own lines, 2 companies fixed bayonets and got out of their trenches. A grey mass of greatcoats and sharp steel stormed their way up the ridge. This tidal wave of fresh Death Corps soldiers relentlessly bore down upon the Vraxians' counterattack. The onslaught of their advance was overwhelming and swiftly broke the enemy's morale. Regarding the Vraxians, whoever managed to survive the bayonet charge fled back in panic towards their own rear lines. The captain and his men quickly cleared out the few remaining defenders in the bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. During the last moments of the battle, Fodor was wounded as a bullet struck his lower arm, but that was but a small price to pay for the glory that was now his. The 468th Regiment had managed their objective. The capture of Fort C-585 had not come a moment too soon. The darkened clouds broke and a heavy rainstorm poured down on the troops. The slopes of Mortuary Ridge turned into slippery, muddy torrents, with next to no grip. In their hasty retreat, many Vraxians were swept off their feet or even got stuck in the sludge. As the extreme weather prevented the Death Corps from pursuing their foes, they simply raised their lasguns and picked off the stragglers who had not managed to escape through the mud in time. The weather had made any attacks on the steep slopes practically impossible. Unsuccessful assaults further along the line were ordered to halt their advance and make their way to Fort C-585 instead. Here, they would regroup and hunker down in order to prepare themselves for the Vraxian counterattack that would certainly come once the weather had calmed down. But before they had time to recover from the battle, to their surprise, a devastating orbital bombardment began. They had not been informed that while the attack on Mortuary Ridge was taking place, the Chaos Armada had successfully defeated the Imperial Navy above Vrax. The 88th Siege Army had no weapons to fend off the enemy ships in lower orbit, and so the traitorous fleet had free rein to turn their weapons towards the surface to deliver their payloads. From a distance, Captain Fodor and his men witnessed the orbital bombardment target the trench lines where their own assault had begun earlier that day. The Chaos battleship's lance battery salvos plowed the surface and blasted scorched craters where the rock turned to blackened glass from the extreme heat. Their macro cannons pulverized entire dugouts and bunkers with a single hit. Even on the Mortuary Ridge, they could feel the blast waves of the distant bombardment. But that was not all, because when the bombardment lifted, hundreds of Dreadclaw drop pods made their way down towards the surface. With little in the way of anti-air defenses, there was nothing that could be done to stop them. Filled to the brim with bloodthirsty Astartes, they landed with great impact amongst the Death Corps trenches. Among them were warbands of Skull-Takers, World-Eaters, and Berserkers of Scalathrax. Once deployed, the Chaos Space Marines rampaged through the lines, slaughtering any unfortunate guardsmen they could get their hands on. It wasn't long before the traitors realized most of the Death Corps soldiers were in fact not in their trenches, but stationed on the ridgeline, and so a second wave of Dreadclaw drop pods were launched and rained down directly on Fort C-585. With great impacts, the drop pods crashed into the soil, disembarking their cargo of frenzied traitor legionaries. The hatches of the few remaining tanks were ripped open by powered armored hands, pulling out the screaming crew and slaughtering them one by one. Fodor's troops hunkered down inside the captured bunkers and aimed their Maltha weapons at the reinforced doors. The first enemies who barged inside were greeted by a vaporizing blast wave to the face that instantly stopped the heretical superhuman in their tracks. But despite killing several of them, the Death Corps didn't stand a chance against the traitorous onslaught. The enraged Astartes continued to rush inside from all directions, barely inconvenienced by the shots of lasgun fire aimed at them. In the narrow confines of the bunkers, there was nowhere to run or hide from the roaring chain axes of the berserkers, and soon the floors of the bunkers were soaked with Imperial blood. Captain Fodor met his end when he was decapitated. His severed head was added to the pile of corpses as the Chaos Marines went looking for more victims of their carnage. With rampaging Chaos Marines behind and within their lines, the forces of the 88th Siege Army were in total disorder. There was no way to keep track of the fast-moving elite enemy forces. It seemed as if they had simply appeared wherever and whenever they pleased. They would strike at the front lines, then target an ammunition depot or an artillery position in the rear. Next, a bunker in the communication trenches would get wiped out, cutting their communications. Most of their weapons were unable to penetrate the power armor. Only the scarce heavy weapon teams had any chance of taking them down, but these proved difficult to deploy in the utter turmoil. The only respite that the 88th Siege Army could enjoy was that the traitor Astartes had little intention of capturing and holding any ground. The individual warbands seemed more interested in outcompeting each other in terms of havoc and slaughter, in order to gain the favor of their dark gods. And so, when a frenzied warband had rampaged through an area, what was left of the Imperial troops could once again regroup and attempt to secure the area. Encouraged by these unholy reinforcements, the Vruxians tried their luck against the Death Corps trenches as well. In a lot of places, the extensive digging would now pay off, and the 88th Siege Army was able to fend off the attacks. While in others, especially areas where the traitor Marines had struck the hardest, they were simply too undermanned to stop the advancing enemy. What had once been a continuous surrounding trench network around the inner defensive line had now been turned into large pockets of resistance. But that was not all. With the Imperial Navy routed from the system by the Chaos Armada, their supply lines from space were cut off. For now, the initial landing zones on the Saratama Plains were still plenty stockpiled, but if nothing was done to re-establish naval control over the system, they would eventually run out of supplies. The Death Corps are unwavering combatants willing to fight to the last man, but even they require weapons and ammunition. High Command would have to work overtime if they were to have any hope of salvaging the extremely dire situation. But it was clear that Julka was not the man for this job. News of the impending failure reached Lord Commander Militant of Segmentum Obscurus, who started an investigation to figure out how it was possible that despite the vast amount of Imperial troops sent to Vrux, the siege had still gone so horribly wrong. If Julka were to be found lacking in his duties as commander, he would be punished for these failures. But mere disciplinary action against High Command would do little for the Death Corps soldiers facing annihilation on the battlefield right now. Although a new commander for the 88th Siege Army would have to be found in due time, something more would have to be done right now in order to avert a complete disaster. As much as had already been invested into the siege, and as completely hopeless as the endless meat grinder appeared, they couldn't abandon an entire army to a fate of guaranteed defeat. But before help would be able to arrive, the Death Corps would be on their own to face an even bigger threat. Reports came in that Aaron's Bane had survived its crash landing on the planet and was disembarking its troops onto the Chalea Plateau. The vast majority of its cargo had been damaged or killed in the impact, but what had remained was still a considerable force to be reckoned with. Not least because several titans of Legio Vulcanum had successfully managed to disembark the wreckage and now prepared to walk onto the front lines. The traitor legions and a huge ragtag band of renegades composed of both vehicles and a large mob of infantry on foot had 160 kilometers of terrain to cover before they would be able to join the battle. But their lust for battle after their long voyage from the Eye of Terror towards Vrux drove them forward with great haste. Meanwhile, the 88th Siege Army was scrambling to properly organize defensive maneuvers. Through their magnoculars, local command units could already observe the faint glimmer of enemy titans visible on the horizon. The Horde had already bypassed the Mora Gorge and advanced straight towards the rear of the Death Corps lines. It would be up to the 101st Siege Regiment and the tanks of the 11th Assault Corps to deal with the Chaos Horde. If they could delay the onslaught, the rest of the 1st Line Corps would have a chance to rendezvous with the 30th Line Corps to their west and escape the potential encirclement. If they failed to stop the approach, a large part of the 88th Siege Army would be trapped, with their backs towards a deep ravine called the Denris Trench, With everything that had already gone wrong thus far, such a catastrophic loss could not be allowed to happen. A large part of the Chaos Infantry halted near the abandoned second defensive line to rest after their long march, but the God Machines and mechanized troops continued their tireless advance across the wasteland, eager to deliver battle. Determined to intercept their enemy and buy time for the rest of the army to get out, their Macarius and Leman Russ tanks rolled forward. The brave crews of the 11th Assault Corps prepared for a suicidal engagement against the Titans of Legio Volcanum. In a fierce void battle, the Chaos Fleet had all but broken the Imperial blockade and routed the remaining Loyalist navy above Vrax. During the battle, however, a large Chaos transport called the Acheron's Bane had been fatally struck by one of Admiral Raziak's fire ships and crash-landed onto the planet. Aboard, it had carried the titans of the traitorous Legio Volcanum. Unfortunately for the 88th Siege Army, a large number of these god machines had managed to survive the crash, and their remnants had soon disembarked and assembled onto the Chalia Plateau, ready to march onto the Death Corps rear lines. After a long march accompanied by a mob of vehicles and infantry, they had finally arrived at the front lines, and their corrupted machine spirits were eager to deliver battle. If nothing was done to halt this enemy advance, the 30th and 1st Line Corps would be outflanked and destroyed. The task of delaying the traitors and giving the rest of the Imperial Army the time to reposition themselves and prepare defenses had been assigned to the tanks of the 11th Assault Corps. They knew their mission was suicidal. Few, if any, tank crews had faced Titans and lived to tell the tale, but the brave soldiers of the Death Corps prepared themselves to face the onslaught nonetheless. Outnumbered and outgunned, they drove forward, determined to bring righteous fury to the foes of the almighty God Emperor. The tracks of the many tanks and artillery created large clouds of dust as both the traitors and the Loyalists' tank columns drove over the desolate wastelands towards one another. In the distance, the massive lumbering silhouettes of the Chaos monstrosities were already visible. Commanders looking through their magnoculars recognized the shapes of Warhound and Reaver-class Titans steadily marching their way. Despite the Warhound being considered a Scout-class Titan, it is still an immensely powerful war machine, standing over 17 meters tall, and its formidable weapons are more than capable of destroying heavily armored vehicles with frightening ease. On one arm, the standard armament would either be multiple lasers or a mega bolter, and on the other, usually some type of heavier anti-Titan or anti-armor weapon, like the plasma blast gun. But considering the forces of chaos and their lack of uniformity, nobody could truly predict what armaments it would wield. Its relative high speed makes it a fearsome foe that will move in packs to mercilessly hunt down its prey. The presence of even this smallest type of Titan was more than enough to completely overthrow the balance of power on Vrax into the traitor's favor. But that was not all that had arrived from the crash. The Reaver-class Titan is an ancient battle machine. Classified as a medium-sized Titan, it wields even more devastating weaponry than the Warhound, and is far more difficult to destroy due to it having more void shield generators. It usually carries at least one long-ranged weapon that allows it to fire at an extreme range to destroy enemy armor, but up close, it carries an even more devastating amount of firepower. Although Reavers are not nearly as big as some of the larger Titans, these relics from a bygone technical age are able to destroy almost anything standing in their paths. Although their relatively exposed generators on the back make them vulnerable to outflanking, their strong frontal armor plates and mid to long-range weapons make them incredibly suited for the large, open battlefields on Vrax. By now, the Death Corps troops were fully aware of the near-impossible odds they were matched up against. Leman Russes and Baneblades wield capable weapons in their own right. These tanks had already brought them many victories on Vrax. But against these massive god machines, they would definitely struggle to hold their own, if not outright lose immediately. But the Death Corps' relentless orchestration of warfare is not known for doing anything with half measures. The 88th Siege Army had brought an overcompensating amount of different weapon types to the siege. Despite the initial displeasure of the Manufactorum at what had initially appeared to be such an indifferent misassignment of specialized material, now they were more than happy to know that amongst the mechanized ranks moving forward to battle the Titans rode several Shadow Swords. The Shadow Sword battle tank, armed with its forward-facing volcano cannon, is a notorious Titan killer. It is nearly identical to the super heavy Baneblade, but its armament is specialized to disable Titans in a single blow. The volcano cannon is amongst the Imperium's most powerful laser weapons, able to overpower void shields and turn even the thickest armor into molten slag. Granted, the tank is fairly slow, difficult to aim, and has a very low rate of fire. On top of that, not every shot is guaranteed to penetrate a Titan's void shield. But when it does manage to penetrate, the damage is devastating. For as mighty as Titans are, most of their protection comes from their ability to generate void shields. Under normal conditions, a Titan will engage in battle for as long as its void shields are operational. When they start failing under heavy sustained fire, it will then retreat, and if the situation allows it, to take on a more supporting role within its battle group, at least until the void shields have recovered. But the mere existence of a tank on the battlefield capable of penetrating all of its defenses with a single shot is a severe risk that should not be overlooked. The thought of losing one of their invaluable god machines to something as low-brow as a tank instills a deep fear within the proud Titan crews, and so merely the threat of a few Shadow Swords on the battlefield is sometimes enough to dissuade Titans from engaging at all. But the Titans of Legio Volcanum had not traveled all the way from the Eye of Terror to back down now. Their unholy corruption fueled their lust for battle, as they marched straight towards their enemy without hesitation. And there was something the Imperial forces did not yet realize. The traitor forces had another trick hidden up their sleeves. Out of nowhere, the Imperial troops were suddenly attacked from the air as fighter aircraft strafed their formations. Throughout the war, the Vraxian defenders had not had any aircraft, and with everybody focusing their attention on the oncoming Titans, the attack from above had come as a complete surprise. Even the usually well-prepared Death Corps did not see this one coming. The 11th Assault Corps had not considered bringing any dedicated anti-air weapons to this battle, and so there was little they could do to protect themselves from the sudden aerial attack. Tank turret gunners tried their best to fire their heavy weapons at the enemy flyers, but this did little to stop the fast-moving airplanes from dropping their bombs on the advancing vehicles. Having totally free reign in the skies, the enemy pilots could freely choose their targets, and the disrupting effects on the tank formation was formidable. Fortunately for the Imperial troops, after a while the enemy ran out of ammunition, and the enemy fighters vanished from the battlefield. But the damage was already done. Before the battle had truly begun, several tanks were already destroyed, and the enemy had not lost a single airplane. In the midst of the disorder, it was difficult to tell if any of their desperately required Shadow Swords had even survived the surprise attack. But if they had not, well, it would simply be too late to turn back now. The Reaver Titans were already in firing range, and started raining down their long-ranged armaments upon the 11th Assault Corps. The Chaos tanks hurried forward past the Titans to get into the battle as well. On both sides, the tank gunners tried to score direct hits against their opponents and disable as many enemy vehicles as they could. The neatly organized tank formations quickly fell apart in the maelstrom of battle. The artillery units halted and made ready to provide supporting fire. The Titans had marched into the range of their heavy cannons, and soon an impressive cannonade rained down on their void shields. The battle-hungry Titans wreaked havoc amongst the tanks, showing little concern for their motorized allies on the ground, and causing damage to both friend and foe. As the mechanized clash commenced, the carnage was tremendous. Soon many black columns of smoke rose from the battlefield as destroyed tanks burnt out. The Shadow Swords had moved into position and opened fire on the Titans. They scored several direct hits against their foes, but the Chaos Titans must have either been protected by dark magic, or the shots simply did not manage to disintegrate the void shields. The Titan Killers had failed to do their job, but their defiant firepower had enraged the Titans. With war horns blaring and daring provocation, the god machines increased the intensity of their carnage. Within moments, the warhounds were already upon the slow-moving shadow swords, and they were destroyed before they had been able to take down a single titan. Meanwhile, to the left and right flanks, more enemy armored vehicles carrying Chaos Space Marines moved in to encircle the Imperial troops. The battle would be over quickly. Without their shadow swords and attacks from the flanks, it was only a matter of time before the remaining tanks were also destroyed. By some miracle, a handful of troops managed to escape the massacre and made it back towards their own lines, ready to fight another day. But a large section of the 11th Assault Corps was completely wiped out. Despite their tragic losses, the heroic counterattack had bought enough time for the entirety of the 30th Line Corps to reposition and start digging in their new front line. In their new makeshift trenches, the Death Corps would be able to move their shadow swords and artillery pieces in prepared, concealed positions. This strategic advantage would greatly improve their chances of holding their own against the Titans. The 1st Line Corps was a different story, however. With their backs towards the Demi's trench, there had been nowhere to go for them but north to occupy the previously held position of the 30th Line Corps. But the relatively small gap in the terrain had made it difficult to reposition the entire Line Corps swiftly, and so progress of moving the army had been slow. To the horror of the Imperial commanders, the Chaos advance had not been delayed long enough for all regiments to get out of the trap in time. There was a serious risk of the retreating 1st Line Corps being outflanked by the enemy's fast-moving mechanized forces. In order to prevent this disaster from happening, some troops would have to stay behind and hold the rear. The 19th Regiment would be the last one out of the pocket, and thus it was decided that they would instead function as the rear guard. Their orders were to dig themselves in the narrow front and prevent the enemy from capitalizing on the 1st Line Corps' difficult retreat. The 19th Regiment would be cut off from the rest of the army and have nowhere to fall back to. This was, however, still preferable to running the risk of having the flank rolled up by enemy tanks and losing the entire war. With the enemy Titans and war bands of Chaos Space Marines freely roaming the plains, this was of course a suicidal assignment. But if there's one thing we've learned from the Death Corps, it is that no sacrifice is too great. The officers of the 19th Regiment were ready to follow these orders without a second thought, and ordered their troops to hold the line. But it was unlikely that they truly realized what horrors they were about to face. A singled-out regiment was an easy target, and the various Chaos warbands of Nurgle who had arrived on Vrax would not let this opportunity go to waste. The Lords of Decay and the Apostles of Contagion had already gotten their hands on the armory stockpiles on Vrax. Amongst these lay vast amounts of the infamous gas weapon trimethylene thaloxiac tertius, known simply as TP3. TP3 is not just any poison gas. It is a horrible combination of highly acidic and corrosive molecules that create a lethal green cloud. When breathed in, it is fatal, and the horrendous damage to the respiratory system kills its victim within 30 seconds. But wearing a gas mask may not be sufficient because it can melt skin from bone within minutes. In strong enough concentrations, it can even corrode through metal and armor. The reason why it's not commonly used in general warfare and only kept as a weapon of last resort is because it's very difficult to control. Mishandling the substance during deployment can easily cause casualties amongst friendly units. The Chaos Marines did not formally request Cardinal Zaphon for access to this deadly weapon. Instead, they simply plundered the stockpiles and took as much TP3 as they could get their hands on. The other Chaos warbands, like the Cornate Berserkers and Alpha Legionnaires, did not interfere as they were busy with their own agendas. They cared little about the followers of Nurgle were up to, and so they could freely test this deliciously toxic weapon. Although the Nurgle worshippers did not have much experience with this type of gas, they were confident its effects would surely please their unholy master of decay. As the 19th Regiment waited in their trench for the inevitable attack against their lines, the first green clouds rolled towards them. All Krieg guardsmen were trained and equipped to withstand chemical warfare, but it remained to be seen if their gear and training would hold up against the corrosive TP3. As the clouds reached the front lines, it slowly started burning holes into their impregnated trench coats. As it got through the fabric, it started melting their skin, which bubbled up into huge, painful blisters. Despite their suffering, the stoic Death Corps soldiers would hold the line. But where the poisonous clouds were the densest, the TP3 seeped into their respirator boxes and corroded it from the inside out. The filters keeping the deadly fumes out of the gas masks started failing. In many places along the line, guardsmen started choking as their lungs started foaming up blood. The worst afflicted amongst these had their eyes melt right out of their sockets as they turned blind. Soon their skin began to dissolve and putrid flesh dripped away, exposing the white bones underneath. Those who had not died already cried on their knees in agonizing groans of pain, begging for the Emperor's mercy. Before any shots had been fired, several areas in the line had already been completely wiped out. While in some places the Death Corps soldiers had endured, and an organized resistance remained. But even from a distance it was easily observed what carnage this weapon had inflicted amongst the defenders. No other Imperial Guard regiment could withstand the onslaught of such an acidic gas attack so well. The Plague Marines were impressed by the Death Corps' resilience. If only these troops would be willing to accept Grandfather Nurgle's blessings, they would surely make worthy minions. They relished their potent new weapon, but were also eager to witness the beautiful decay from up close. And so, they started the engines of their rusting armored vehicles and slowly drove forward into the green clouds, while methodically firing their heavy bolters at any survivors. Despite the horrid effects the TP3 had inflicted upon their ranks, the remaining resistance put up a valiant fight. But the putrid monstrosities proved difficult to kill, and facing them in close quarters combat proved too much. Their lasguns barely seemed to hurt these moving corpses. Even an expertly performed bayonet thrust into what would otherwise be considered vital organs did nothing to stop them. Only heavy weapons seemed to have any effect, but after the corroding gas attack, they did not have many of these still operational. They would not be able to hold out for long. As the green clouds started evaporating, a second wave of attackers made up of chaos cultists and militia joined the battle as well. The Death Corps soldiers were now getting absolutely slaughtered to the last man. In defiance, several platoon leaders called artillery fire on their own position to take as many enemies with them to their deaths as possible. Earthshaker shells now plowed the ground, destroying anything and anyone caught out in the open. In their final moments, the Death Corps troops knew their incredible suffering and sacrifice had brought them even closer to redemption from the Emperor. With the 19th Regiment completely destroyed, the encirclement of the Varaxian defensive lines was officially broken open, and any final hopes of still finishing the siege within the original time frame was completely smashed. This bad news had already reached Lord Commander Julka, who had seen the writing on the wall. With 2 whole regiments wiped off the map and the imminent defeat of the entire army, he would of course no longer be allowed to continue commanding the Varaxian campaign. And so he had been busy preparing the safe continuation of his military career elsewhere. Using his political connections, he had already arranged himself a comfy new assignment over the 7,003rd Imperial Guard Army. This army was stationed to fight off the continued Orc attacks led by the great war boss Gazgrim. The Orc leader was known as the Great Despot of Dregruk, and an ally of the infamous Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, who had led wars against Armageddon. Fighting the Greenskins was preferable to being sent off to the eastern fringes to combat the ever-increasing Tyranid invasions, as not many troops ever returned from such assignments. And given High Command's failures on Vrax, this would be the fate of many officers. Considering the large number of open fronts against the Orcs, and the bureaucratic nature of such a massive campaign, Julka figured this would allow him time to safely lay low for a while. Once the whole ordeal on Vrax had been forgotten, he would have plenty of opportunity to rise through the ranks once again. But with the Lord Commander gone, a power vacuum formed that needed to be filled. Even though the 88th Siege Army was on the brink of defeat, the battle wasn't over yet, and the army desperately required a new leader. The Ecclesiarchy lobbied for a commander from amongst their own ranks. Surely the lack of progress on Vrax had been a result of the lack of religious fervor. They could even provide a certain amount of their own forces in the form of the renowned Sisters of Battle. Not to be overlooked was the fact that their claim was also supported by the Order Hereticus. Their failure to assassinate Cardinal Zaphon had not been forgotten, and so they still had a vested interest in making sure the siege would end with an imperial victory. Their inquisitors would be able to take the role of officers and lead the troops on the ground. But the Departamenta Munitorum wasn't all too fond of their meddling. The 88th Siege Army had been their responsibility for the duration of the entire siege thus far. Handing over command of the entire army to these religious zealots would only cause more problems. Despite the strong ecclesiarchal and inquisitorial lobby, the Munitorum still had a lot of influence. After all, it was their supply lines that kept the war on Vrax going, and if any organization thought they could simply usurp the 88th Siege Army, it would remain to be seen if the allocated supplies and weapons would keep flowing as steadily as before. In the end, the Lord Militant Obscurus assigned the command to Marshal Arnim Kogori. Kogori was known for his devout faith in the Emperor and his long record of victories. It was believed that with his experience and zealous disposition, he would be able to turn around the war on Vrax. His appointment would not be able to satisfy all factions with the Imperium, but then again, when could their conflicting interests ever be pleased? But before the hopeless situation on Vrax could be resolved, the newly assigned Marshal would first have to assemble a relief force capable of stopping the Chaos onslaught. For the first time, the specialized Krieg engineer regiments would be joining the fighting on Vrax. With them, they would bring even more siege equipment like Hades breaching drills and mole launchers, which the engineers could skillfully deploy to great effect when performing underground warfare. But although more troops from Krieg were always a welcome sight on any battlefield, something more drastic would be required to turn the tide. After all, what could infantry truly hope to do against the overwhelming power of enemy titans? And so, Kogori would also send a request towards Forge World Lucius to ask their Titan Legion for assistance. The Titans wreaking havoc on Vrax had been confirmed to be from the notorious Legio Volcanum. These were the very same traitors who during the Horus Heresy had been the first to side with Chaos. These most corrupted of Dark Mechanicum forces could not be permitted to wander around unopposed. And so Legio Astorum answered Grigori's call for reinforcements. Soon, loyalist Titans would be on their way towards Vrax. The siege had reached a critical point, and despite the large amounts of reinforcements Grigori had received, it would take all his skills in planning and strategic brilliance to turn the war around. With this many ships on their way towards Vrax, the 88th Siege Army would at least have a fighting chance. But before the relief force could land on the surface to reinforce the Imperial Army on Vrax, another battle would first have to be won. The void around Vrax was still in traitorous hands. Battlefleet Scarus had not forgotten their disastrous defeat during the first void battle for Vrax. It was unknown what foul chaos trickery would await the fleet's arrival in the system. It has been a full year since the landing of Chaos reinforcements on Vrax. Their arrival had stopped the 88th Siege Army's campaign plans in their tracks, and put them on the defensive. The shock of orbital bombardment and drop pod assaults had managed to break communications and split the Imperial Army into large pockets of resistance. The brave soldiers of the Death Corps were fighting tooth and nail to avoid a complete disaster. The 19th Regiment had been wiped out completely during their rearguard action in order to save the rest of the army. But despite the heroic last stand, the front line in the east was on the brink of collapse in the face of enemy titans. By now, a large horde of freshly arrived Chaos Militia infantry had stationed themselves comfortably in the remnants of the abandoned 2nd Defensive Line. The 30th Line Corps had repositioned themselves with newly dug trenches to face them. But the enemy didn't just sit idly by. Whenever their overlords called them into action, a fanatic mob of mutants and renegades stormed over no man's land in suicidal fashion. Although these crude assaults gained little ground, it put extra strain on the already thinly stretched Imperial lines. Traitor Astartes, Titans, and aircraft continuously stalked the wastelands of Vrax at will. They had come to bring slaughter in the name of their dark gods, and slaughter they would deliver. Not a day went by where the soldiers of the 88th Siege Army had any respite. Wherever the 88th Siege Army was caught off guard, the servants of Chaos attempted to butcher as many of them as possible, preferably in the most savage ways imaginable. But the portable void shield generators had proven crucial in protecting the 88th Siege Army's most vital infrastructure. Despite the completely one-sided engagements, their logistics were still largely operational. They managed to bring just enough weapons and munitions to the front lines to continue the fight. Of course, their supply lines from space had been cut off by the Chaos fleet, but their well-stockpiled storage depots far on the Saratama plains, had proven sufficient for now. Despite the 88th Siege Army's perilous situation, they had not yet broken. After a while, contact between the line corps had been re-established, and they had even managed to plug the front lines with whatever reserves could be spared. Unfortunately, they were still at a risk of being outflanked from the northern side. With the loss of the entire 19th Regiment and the rest of the regiments already spread thin, no infantry could be spared to extend the lines any further. Instead, their tanks and Death Rider forces had been ordered to continuously patrol the northern wastes and prevent the encirclement of the 88th Siege Army. With literally all troops preoccupied with defense, there was simply no way to launch any counter-offensives. Considering the current balance of power on Vrax, the traitors' combined forces could have wiped out the Death in months. But the Chaos reinforcements had come to Vrax with their own agenda. They had proved difficult, if not downright impossible, to cooperate with. Of course, the extra troops had given the initial Vraxian army some long-awaited breathing space, but ironically, the change of events in favor of the defenders had brought division amongst their ranks. The Plague Marines' ruthless plundering of Vraxian stockpiles without permission had been a direct affront against Zaphen's authority. And so far the Titans and large bands of renegade militia had not followed a single order from High Command whatsoever. The blatant insubordination left many formerly unwavering lines had been sporadic at best. Only the truly zealous followers of Zaphen made serious attempts at breaking the Imperial lines. They successfully pushed the 88th Siege Army back here and there, but they could not win this war. But for all his lucky break was worth to them, the soldiers of Krieg were still stuck on Vrax, fighting a hellish war they couldn't possibly hope to win. They had become playthings of marauding Chaos warbands, doomed to be destroyed in an unholy ritual of slaughter. Without reinforcements, sooner or later they would perish. Fortunately for them, such reinforcements were on the way. As far as the Imperium was aware, the void around Vrax was still under traitor control. After the few surviving Imperial ships abandoned the system, they had not been able to gather any new intel on the situation. For all they knew, the entire Chaos Armada could still be stationed around Vrax. Kogori's reinforcement fleet had been making haste.
He already mowed down a large number of Death Corps.
The greenskins was preferable. The ambush had caused a... But perhaps they should not have made the mistake of forgetting they were dealing with the Alpha Legion. And so, as the convoy approached, they were caught by complete surprise when suddenly the Chaos battleship's great plasma reactors roared into life and began moving. The vessel became immediately clearly visible on all auger arrays, and the escort ship sprang into action to counter the threat, but it was too late. The Anarchy's heart was already within firing range, and its first salvos were inescapable. Direct hits immediately caused two of the sword-class frigates to blow up and vanish into the void. Duke de Wall's void shields were barely able to hold against the repeated laser impacts. A second volley raked her hull and destroyed all her starboard thrusters, leaving it unable to steer effectively. The first transport, loaded with fuel and ammunition, was hit. It miraculously survived the blow, but was now left drifting helplessly into the void, forcing the rest of the convoy to make evasive maneuvers. The Duke de Wall returned fire from its broadside cannons. The convoy was ordered to make full speed toward Vrax, while the Lunar-class destroyers would attempt to keep the enemy busy. But the Anarchy's heart now had its eyes on the prize. The easily identifiable Mechanicus transport was by far the most valuable target. If it was up to the Alpha Legion, these Titans would never arrive on the planet, and so the Chaos ship moved in for the kill. But the General Daihane speedily arrived from the rearguard and fired a flurry of torpedoes to block the enemy's approach. The Anarchy's heart was extremely sturdy, but sailing straight through a full salvo of torpedoes would likely prove too much for even the ancient to spoil a battleship, forcing it to alter its course. This allowed time for the escort ships to interpose themselves in front of the valuable cargo. The courageous action cost them heavy losses as the Anarchy's heart lashed out with all its weapons at anything within range. Two more sword-class frigates were disabled, but the convoy was steadily getting out of harm's way. Before the Anarchy's heart could move in pursuit of the transports, it would first have to deal with the two Lunar-class destroyers. But having relied so much on the element of surprise and the opening salvos, it turned out that the traitors had bitten off more than they could chew. With the Imperial ships on both sides, the Chaos ship was taking quite a beating. All ships involved in the battle were providing as much firepower as their crews could possibly deliver, and something would have to break. Duke de Wall's void shields were now completely failing, and the damage it was taking could not be sustained much longer. Soon, the ship would risk being lost to the void. But her captain refused to retreat, instead continuing to pour fire into its enemy. In the end, it was the Anarchy's heart who chose to disengage. It was badly damaged and realized the opportunity to catch her prey was lost. Rather than risk destruction, it chose to flee the system. Her engines roared as it transferred all power to its thrusters in order to escape. General Daihane now had to choose between chasing down the enemy and having a chance to potentially destroy the ancient Chaos ship, or save the remaining crew of the Duke de Wall and the other crippled ships. Hundreds of them already lay dead at their guns, or had been thrown out into the void by explosions. Crippled beyond hope of repair, the ships were falling apart. If no help was offered, all of them would surely perish. Despite the unfathomable price of destroying the notorious Anarchy's heart, the captain of the General Daihane could not stomach leaving the rest of his fleet to their fate, and so gave the order to stop the chase and start a rescue operation. While the surviving crew of the destroyed Imperial ships were being ferried to safety, the Anarchy's heart sailed into the asteroid's field and escaped. The ambush had caused a considerable toll on the fleet. But despite the setback, most of the supplies and all of the Titans had safely reached Vrax and could now join the war. Soon, many thousands of men and tanks by the hundreds disembarked on the Saratama plains. Weapons, munitions, vehicles, fuel, rations, and all other manner of equipment was being brought down to the surface and immediately sent to the front lines. The new arrivals wasted no time but marched directly into the relentless meat grinder of Vrax in an attempt to turn the siege around. But most importantly, the huge landers of the Mechanicus had made planetfall. Down their huge ramps marched the Titans of Legio Astorum's battle group, 22 Titans in total. Their High Princeps, Rant Droka, was ready to lead them into war. Warhound and Reaver Titans blared their engines for the upcoming triumph as they began their long march over the Saratama plains towards the front lines. The machine spirits were eager to deliver battle to the outnumbered Titans of Legio Volcanum. Once those foul traitors were dealt with, the God Machine's incredible firepower would inevitably break the Vraxians' will to resist. With the assistance of loyalist Titans on Vrax, the 88th Siege Army would be given another opportunity to achieve victory in the name of the Emperor. With a new influx of men and material, the Death Corps would no longer be on the defensive. With supplies and morale restored, the soldiers of Krieg were once again eager to charge over no man's land and deliver cold steel to their enemies. But despite these hopeful events, Marshal Kogori's new campaign plan would still have to prove itself. With the reinforcements' successful arrival, the 88th Siege Army's imminent defeat was staved off, but they would still be a long way ahead of them before they could capture the Citadel and bring the renegade Cardinal Zaphon to justice. The Kogori offensive was about to begin. The Imperial Navy was once again in firm control of the space around Vrax. The Sword-class frigates had searched the system to hunt down the damaged Anarchy's heart, but there was no trace of the ancient Chaos battleship to be found. Convoys of Imperial cargo ships could now safely traverse the sector and deliver a near-endless stream of supplies to the planet. On the surface below, fresh troops and equipment steadily flowed into the front lines. As the newly arrived manpower took their place in the regiments, the 88th Siege Army regained its former fighting spirit. The veteran guardsmen could finally enjoy some well-earned rest, and the horrors of the last 12 months now seemed like a passing fever dream. There were finally enough replacement parts for the worn-out weapons and vehicles to be properly repaired, With the influx of new uniforms, plenty of food, ammunition, building materials, and fuel, the army was in better shape than ever before. For over a year, the Chaos Forces had enjoyed complete air superiority in the skies above Vrax. Although the portable void shield generators had been hugely important in protecting the 88th Siege Army's logistics against bombing raids, there was not much they could do to challenge the enemy harassment from above. But the arrival of extra anti-air defenses now granted the Imperial troops the opportunity to fight back. No longer would the enemy fighters have the luxury of carelessly flying wherever they pleased. Any Vraxian pilot with the temerity to strafe a trench line would henceforth be met by a hail of flak. And that was not all. The Imperial Navy had brought their own aerial troops. Wherever formations of enemy air squadrons dared to venture too far from the citadel, they would be met by Imperial Navy fighter planes deployed from the ships in orbit. The skies above Vrax were now the site of intense dogfights between the pilots of the 717th Navy Fighter Wing and Chaos Hellblades. These were costly engagements for both sides, but due to the Imperium's unwavering commitment, the heretical aircraft were often forced to retreat back to the safety of their own anti-air defense network. All in all, the supply lines of Vrax were running as smooth and uninterrupted as could realistically be expected. The Munitorum Labor Corps was already working hard to construct aircraft landing strips to further increase the 717th Fighter Wing capacity, and over time, it was expected that the Imperium should be able to gain complete air superiority. As soon as the skies were cleared out, the Marauder bombers would be able to perform their bombing campaigns against key targets in the Vraxian defenses. The Titans of Legio Restorum had finished their long march over the Saratama plains, and now waited patiently behind the front lines for the right moment to strike. The Mechanicus forces would remain a separate force under their own command structure, not beholden to the orders of Amam Kogori. High Princeps Rand Droka had her own priorities. She was solely focused on destroying the traitors of Legio Volcanum, but she was willing to work with the Imperial Commander and support his campaign plans. After all, the cooperation was of mutual benefit. Having access to the supportive firepower of the disciplined Death Corps artillery gunners in order to suppress the enemy Titan's void shields was an advantage that she did not overlook. For now, the Death Corps engineers would be distributed and attached to the Line Corps in a supporting role. Although Kogori had requested their assistance on Vrax in an offensive capacity, it would take some preparations before they were ready to be deployed in combat. They had come to Vrax with specialized digging equipment, which would allow them to wage an underground war in order to undermine the enemy's front lines and potentially even break into the vast network of Vraxian storage facilities. The digging of trenches in the loose Vraxian soil had been relatively straightforward, but deep underground excavations would be of a more complex nature. With the vast amount of rainstorms on Vrax, flooding and the consequential collapse of tunnels was a significant risk. In order to reach a substratum sturdy enough, the Death Corps engineers would have to dig deep, which would bring a plethora of different challenges. The infrastructure to bring large amounts of men, equipment, oxygen, electricity, and fuel deep underground would have to be built. And so, before this task could begin, they would first have to research the best locations and methods to perform these operations. In order to avoid detection, the mine entrances would have to be positioned far behind the front line, and so it would take time before the tunnels could reach the enemy lines. And so, the engineers diligently and patiently began digging. In the meantime, Kogori would endeavor to reclaim lost ground. The start of his campaign plan relied upon, once again, completely encircling the Vraxian inner defensive line. In order to achieve this, he took note from the plans of his predecessor, Lord Commander Julka. In traditional fashion, Kogori simply ordered the start of another massive bombardment campaign against the enemy defenses. All along the front, the Imperial cannons opened fire, raining down a storm of shells upon the Vraxian trenches. The bombardment would not nearly reach the same heights as during Julka's big push, but the blunt approach should not be underestimated. The bombardment had plenty of effect in its own right, and the Vraxians were not at all too pleased to be on the receiving end of a massive bombardment once again, and so, in an attempt to hinder their foe, the Vraxian artillery gunners responded in kind. But against the combined guns of the 88th Siege Army, the counter-battery fire would have limited effect. The Vraxian defenders in the front lines would have to endure an endless barrage for several days. Kogori was well aware of the Death Corps' reputation for sacrifice. After a year of passivity, the soldiers would be eager to charge, and would not appreciate being held back. The new commander was determined to make a good first impression on the soldiers from Krieg. Once the artillery had done its job, he would order every single infantry regiment to advance over no man's land. So far, it would not appear as if the Marshal possessed any more military finesse than his predecessor. But we should not forget that Amem Kogori was an experienced commander with many successful campaigns under his belt. His additional orders would prove to make all the difference. He had requested Legio Astorum to support the 12th Line Corps assault in Sector 54-46. This show of force would surely draw in a vast amount of enemy armored support units to halt them. Once the Vraxians had committed their tanks to the battle, Kogori would send in his Imperial Navy fighters to wreak havoc on their formations and hopefully pin them down. Supported by tanks, the Titans would then attempt to advance even further into enemy territory and threaten to breach through the enemy lines. But this was actually not to be Kogori's main objective. He suspected that the forward Titan would draw the attention of Legio Vulcanum. The enemy god machines would inevitably march out to meet Legio Astorum in battle and fight for supremacy over the Van Miersland wastes. As tempting as relying on the potential breakthrough may be, Kogori wasn't foolish enough to commit the bulk of his forces right in the maelstrom of a Titan battleground. Instead, he figured that as long as the enemy Titans were kept busy near Sector 54-46, the 30th and 1st Line Corps would be granted the opportunity to advance in the east. With the support of the Assault Corps, they would be able to push the enemy back towards the inner defensive line and complete the planned encirclement. As always, the battle was expected to take a high price for every mile of ground. But with the supply lines restored, the Death Corps once again held the advantage in the long, drawn-out war of attrition. This would be the first time that complex combined arms offenses were about to be performed on Vrax. Infantry, tanks, artillery, aircraft, and Titans would have to work closely together to see this plan succeed. In Sector 54-46, Captain Trian of the 143rd Regiment was ready to charge out of the trenches. He had noticed the mighty god machines of Legio Astorum muster behind his lines, and so he realized this part of the front had been chosen for a special engagement. As the final shells of the bombardment flew overhead and landed in the Vraxian trenches, the order to attack was given. All along the front lines, the Death Corps infantry climbed out of their trenches and marched towards their enemy. The 88th was finally on the offensive again, and the feeling of excitement was in the air. But the glorious moment of the charge wouldn't be enjoyed for long. Soon, the Vraxian guns opened fire into their ranks, and the siege was back to its usual grinding combat. Waves upon waves of infantry were mowed down or got stuck in no man's land. Here and there, groups of soldiers managed to get into the enemy trenches, only to be repelled by counterattacks. For the first few hours, it seemed that the battle was fought in the same old way, with the same old results. But with the assistance of the Titans, on the 12th Line Corps' front, the attack was proceeding well. The god machine's overwhelming firepower crushed bunkers and gun emplacements left and right, smashing a path for Captain Trian and his men to advance. The Vraxians' artillery fire clashed harmlessly into the Titans' void shield generators, and the defenders realized they would need more firepower. As Kogori had expected, the Vraxian heavy tanks were called in for support. From the high ground, the Death Corps commanders observed the terrain through their magnoculars and soon spotted columns of dust on the horizon, thrown up by the tracks of the armored reinforcements. They relayed the coordinates to command of the 717th Navy Fighter Wing, who launched numerous thunderbolts to the skies in order to harass the advancing enemy tanks. As the squadrons moved in for the kill, the anti-air defenses took a heavy toll on them, but the important mission continued regardless. They dropped their bombs strategically, making sure to disable the vehicles in the front and rear of the columns in order to immobilize their formation. Once the formation was brought to a halt, it would be like shooting fish in a barrel. Unfortunately, the enemy air force responded quickly, and Hellblades arrived onto the scene much sooner than expected. As the air filled with streams of bullets, many pilots were forced into dogfights in a bid for survival. As the battle continued, the Thunderbolts were taking too many losses and were eventually ordered to turn back. But a lot of the damage had already been done. The enemy armored reinforcement had been stopped dead in their tracks. Before they would be on the move again, roads would have to be cleared. The heretical tank regiments would require time to reorganize, and many vehicles were in need of repairs. The costly mission had been a success. Although many of the reinforcements would eventually continue on their way towards the front, the delays and damage would give the Titans valuable time to continue their advance uncontested. High in the skies, the pilots had been granted a good vision of the Vraxian inner defensive line, and upon returning, they were debriefed for intel. But to the dismay of High Command, the situation was worse than had been anticipated. During the relative inactivity of the previous year, the defenders had found time to continue fortifying the entire area between the inner defensive line and the citadel, and had turned it into a giant kill zone. As if the 7-kilometer deep defensive lines hadn't been enough, now the entire rear area had been integrated into the defenses. The terrain was now completely scattered with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Even if a breakthrough of the inner defensive line occurred, the Vraxians could continue their resistance as effectively as before. On a strategic level, the distinction between the defensive line and the rear areas had become essentially meaningless. Whereas before most of the 88th Siege Army success had relied upon cracking the defensive lines and rolling up the rear, this would no longer work. The infantry would have to fight for every inch of ground. But as formidable as the defenses may be, they were still no match for Titans. In the face of the Imperial God Machines continuing their rampage in the front lines, Vraxian High Command desperately pleaded with Legio Vulcanum to move in to intercept. As always, communication between Chaos forces had been severely lacking, and the request proved to be unnecessary. As soon they had become aware that Legio Astorum had amassed near Sector 54-46, the traitor Titans had already marched against the Loyalists of their own accord. As soon as they arrived, the Titans clashed and the intensity of the fight increased tenfold. Long-distance lasers flashed over the battlefield. Void shields sparked and flared under the high-energy impacts of the massive weapons. Undeterred by their opponent's display of force, both sides continued marching forward. Soon, the legions were fully engaged, with neither side holding anything back. Volcano cannons scorched the earth as it passed over the heads of the ground troops. Volleys of rockets were fired and impacted with devastating results. Any infantry and tanks caught in the crossfire were doomed to perish. Legio Vulcanum was slightly outnumbered against the 22 Imperial Titans, which put them at a disadvantage, but the devious traitors had fought side by side with War Master Horus during the heresy, and their renowned legion was not to be underestimated. A Reaver Titan by the name of Invigila Alpha moved forward, firing its Gatling guns, its blazingly hot barrels sending hundreds of rounds against the traitors every few seconds. But during its daring advance, it had carelessly moved out of position. Legio Vulcanum would not let this opportunity go to waste, and turned their combined firepower upon the Reaver. Soon its void shields were overloaded by concentrated bursts of several Vulcan megabolters. Before the tech priests and servitors could get them back online, a direct hit by a volcano cannon against its command bridge proved fatal. The superheated blast melted straight through its armor and eliminated its crew. The Titan seized, standing motionless and disabled. Here the husk would remain standing for the remainder of the war, slowly rusting away on the Van Meersland wastes, as a testimony that Legio Vulcanum had scored first blood. The Titan battle would continue for several days, the apocalyptic intensity of the clash halting the ground troops from achieving further progress on this part of the front. Meanwhile, with the enemy Titans occupied in the west, the 30th and 1st Line Corps wasted no time with their advance in the east. Tanks had gathered en masse and were ready to roll forward in support of the infantry. The fast-moving vehicles would play a crucial role in securing their northern flank and enveloping the enemy forces. Together, the troops of the 30th Line Corps and Assault Corps would swing around the flank of the 1st Line Corps in their attempt to close the gap around the inner defensive line. Their attack first ran into the entrenched Chaos Militia holding up in the remnants of the 2nd defensive line. These ragtag bands of troops had apparently not spent any time repairing or improving the defenses they were occupying. The bunkers and trenches had been designed to face outwards, and it did not take the Death Corps soldiers long to force them to abandon these positions. The first part of the assault proceeded better than expected. Large groups of renegade militia now moved over the plains in order to escape the Death Corps' advance. The Vraxian defenders, still holding the long-neglected eastern defensive line, could see the writing on the wall. If nothing was done, they would soon find themselves isolated from the rest of their army again. They had held their secluded position for the entirety of the war, patiently waiting for either new orders or the 88th Siege Army to attack their lines. but over the many years neither had come. With the likelihood of being cut off a second time and missing out on the war, they decided to act on their own accord. And so, after more than a decade of inactivity, the Varaxians finally abandoned the eastern defensive and joined the retreating Chaos Militia troops back towards the inner defensive line, where they could continue the fight. Meanwhile, the 1st Line Corps had a more difficult time. Their part of the plan was being held up by organized Chaos Space Marine warbands. These superhuman warriors would not be pushed back so easily. Despite the 1st Line Corps' best efforts, the traitor Astartes would not budge, and their advance was ground to a halt. The slaughter of the 19th Regiment at the hand of the Nurgle worshippers and the notorious TP-3 gas had not been forgotten. The Death Corps' commanders figured that some corrosive toxins of their own would be the perfect retaliation, and the deployment of poison gas may force the Astartes out of their comfortable positions. Seeing his overall campaign plans thwarted by the Chaos Warbands, Marshal Kogori gave permission to perform a large-scale gas attack on the eastern front. Soon, large streams of poison steadily crawled towards the enemy, once again enveloping the eastern front into a thick, green deadly cloud. Although this new gas would not match the corrosive aspects of the TP-3, the Death Corps made sure to overcompensate and completely soak the area. The density of the gas was so thick that indeed many of the Chaos Warbands figured it was to their best interest to abandon the region. But the gas attack had played right into the Nurgle worshippers' hands. Although the other warbands had been forced to retreat, the Lords of Decay saw little reason to leave. In fact, this had been exactly what they had been waiting for. With the blessing of Father Nurgle, their undead, rotting bodies could withstand these conditions just fine. Steadily, the area was turning into a sludgy, toxic swamp, permanently soaked in a green mist. The 88th Siege Army had unwittingly assisted the Lords of Decay in transforming this area into the perfect base of operation for the followers of Nurgle. The retreating Varaxian and Renegade infantry now found themselves in trouble, caught between the advancing Imperial onslaught to the north and the untraversable Demas Trench to their rear. They had nowhere to go but through the uninviting Nurgle swamplands. Those lucky enough to be equipped with respirator devices strapped on their gas masks had continued their retreat into the thick green mists. The unfortunate bastards who did not have these would have to make do with more improvised solutions, like holding chemically soaked cloths in front of their faces. But eventually, they too would take their chances and began marching into the swamps. Despite their flanks being protected by those unbudgeable Lords of Decay, it would remain to be seen how many of the infantry would safely make it back to the inner defensive line. For now, the assault halted, and the troops prepared for the next stage of the assault. Once the worst of the gas had dissipated, the attack would continue. If anyone had managed to withstand the thick green clouds, they would soon face the combined force of the 1st and 30th Line Corps. Until that time, a gap on the eastern front would remain, preventing the inner defensive line from being completely surrounded. Back on the Van Miersland wastes, the Titan battle was finally reaching its end. After 5 days of back and forth, both sides were running out of ammunition. Their crews were exhausted and in dire need of rest. Legia Volcanum was the first to withdraw from battle, leaving the Imperial troops to claim a Pyrrhic victory. The battle had been costly. 7 Warhounds and 4 Reaver Titans had been destroyed by the traitors. These would eventually have to be replaced and sent in from their Forge World Lucius to bring the battle group back to its original strength. Princeps Randadroka's leading Reaver Titan by the name of Praetorian was still standing. A tally of victims had been added to her honor banner. All in all, it was estimated that a dozen or so Chaos Titans had been destroyed in total, but the battle was not over. Yet more Chaos Titans would have to be hunted down and destroyed before Legio Astorum's task on Vrax was complete. Supported by tanks and infantry, the remaining Titans prepared to continue pushing forward towards the Citadel. The Vraxians expected to halt this advance were in a hopeless situation. During the earlier battle, one of the Imperial Warhounds had been brought down by the combined efforts of several artillery batteries, but this was their only success. Overall, there was not much the defenders could do to harm these god machines, especially now that the Chaos Titans had abandoned the field of battle. Legio Astorum once more aimed their weapons directly against the hunkered-down Vraxian defenders. Upon witnessing the incredible damage wrought upon their fortifications, many Vraxians suffered Titan shock and lost their will to fight. Those who found themselves in a Titan's path of destruction were struck with panic and fled their bunkers and trenches. Together with the Titans, the 12th Line Corps managed to push far into the enemy's defenses, all the way towards the Curtain Wall. Although not nearly as large and well fortified as the defensive lines, the curtain wall was a formidable structure in its own right that surrounded the citadel on all sides. Its well-protected reinforced gates would prove difficult to breach even for the Titans. This would be a fight for another day. And so, Princeps Randroka ordered the battle group to halt just outside range of the curtain wall's main guns. A large stride had been made towards victory, and the Kogori offensive would be considered a success. But the new commander was well aware that the Titans' unwavering commitment and battle prowess had won him this battle, and it would not be wise to push forward without this support. Before the campaign could continue in earnest, they would need to replenish their munitions and rest. Having done more than could be expected of them, Legio Astorum retreated back to the rear of the line where their Titans would be stationed inside large protected silos to undergo repair and maintenance by the Mechanicus ordnancers. While the army was recovering from the Kogori offensive, the engineers continued digging their tunnels towards their front lines. Their activity had still gone unnoticed by the Vraxian defenders, and an underground network had reached all the way under the inner defensive line. With any luck, they would breach the first Vraxian storage depots. Then the underground war could truly begin. Soon, it would be time for the engineers to prove that Marshal Kogori had been right in bringing their expertise to Vrax. Despite some setbacks, the Kogori offensive had progressed very well. On all fronts, the enemy had been pushed back considerably. The inner defensive line had finally been breached. It must be noted that this important breakthrough had been at least 4 years behind schedule, but High Command considered it to be better late than never. The newly arrived Marshal had undoubtedly proved his strategic superiority over the enemy. The Death Corps troops were confident that under his command, the 88th Siege Army was finally in capable hands. But the Vraxians had never been pushovers. As had been the case so many times before, the defenders had exacted a heavy toll on the attackers. Even under Marshal Kogori's leadership, they had suffered a rate of casualties similar to the bloody offensives that had come before. The big difference, of course, had been the impressive military success, thus not so inconsiderable sacrifice